High above the dark, sleeping ocean, the night air held 1,000 held breaths. If you were to look out the small, round windows of the transport planes, you would see nothing but an endless ocean of shadows, a vast and quiet world where the sky and the water melted perfectly into one another. There was no horizon, no edge to the earth, only the deep, velvety expanse of the night. But inside the long, vibrating metal hulls of the aircraft, the darkness felt entirely different. It was an intimate darkness, a shared space where time seemed to slow down and stretch out, thick and heavy, wrapping around the young men who sat shoulder to shoulder in the dim light. The air inside the cabin hummed with a steady, deep vibration. The engines droned a relentless, low lullaby, a sound so constant and encompassing that it soon stopped being a noise and simply became the heartbeat of the hollow space they occupied. It trembled through the cold aluminum floorboards, rising up through their heavy boots, settling deep into their bones. They were suspended between two worlds. The solid earth they knew, the homes they loved, the lives they had always lived, lay thousands of miles behind them, across that vast and silent sea. And ahead of them, waiting in the misty fields of a foreign countryside, lay a future they could not yet see. But right now, in this suspended moment, there was only the plane, the dark, and the quiet breathing of the men beside them. A pale, soft red glow bathed the interior of the cabin, the only light allowed in the night sky. It painted the faces of the young men in gentle, muted tones, softening the hard edges of their helmets and casting long, soothing shadows against the curved metal walls. In this ruby light, they did not look like soldiers. They looked like what they truly were, boys, sons, brothers, and friends, barely out of school, sitting quietly with their own thoughts. Their faces were smooth, their expressions guarded but soft. There was no anger here, no sudden movements, no loud voices. There was only a profound, collective stillness. They sat in two long rows, facing each other, their knees nearly touching in the narrow aisle. The canvas of their heavy uniforms rustled faintly whenever the plane dipped or swayed in the invisible wind. They were burdened by the weight of their gear. Heavy parachutes pressed against their backs, canvas webbing dug softly into their shoulders, and pockets bulged with the quiet necessities of survival. But the heaviest things they carried in that vibrating cabin weighed nothing at all. They carried memories. They carried love. They carried the fragile, beautiful images of the worlds they had left behind. In the quiet dimness, a young man near the front of the plane closed his eyes and leaned his head back against the cold metal hull. He did not hear the roar of the engines. Instead, if he focused hard enough, he could hear the gentle rustle of wind moving through the tall green cornstalks of his family's farm. He could smell the damp, rich earth just after a summer rain. He could feel the familiar, worn wood of the front porch step beneath his bare feet. He let the memory wash over him, a warm and comforting blanket against the chill of the high-altitude air. It was a small, private sanctuary built of thought and feeling, a place he could retreat to when the uncertainty of the night felt too vast. Further down the row, another young man reached a gloved hand up to his chest, resting it gently over the breast pocket of his uniform. Beneath the rough fabric, resting directly over his beating heart, was a folded piece of paper. The creases were soft and worn, weakened by the countless times it had been opened, read, and carefully refolded in the pale light of a barracks lamp. It was a letter from home. He did not need to open it now. He knew every loop and curve of the ink by heart. He knew the exact shade of the blue fountain pen, the slight smudge near the bottom corner where the writer's hand had rested, the faint, lingering scent of lavender soap that still clung to the fibers of the paper. Pressing his hand against it brought a quiet wave of peace. It was a tether, a delicate thread made of words and ink, pulling him back to a world of front yard gardens, Sunday dinners, and the soft voices of the people who loved him. The fear was there, of course. It would be untruthful to say it was not. But it was not a loud or frantic fear. It was a quiet, polite companion, sitting beside them in the dark, a gentle fluttering in the stomach, a slight tightness in the chest. It was the fear of the unknown, the natural apprehension of stepping out into the dark night sky. Yet, what was far more powerful than the fear was the quiet resilience that filled the space between them. You could see it in the small, almost imperceptible moments of connection that passed up and down the aisle. A sudden patch of turbulence would rock the plane, causing the metal to groan and the young men to sway in their rigid canvas seats. In the aftermath of the jolt, eyes would meet across the narrow aisle. No words were spoken, the drone of the engines made conversation difficult anyway, but an entire language was exchanged in those brief, quiet glances. A slow blink. A slight, upward tilt of the chin. A soft, weary smile that reached only the corners of the mouth. It was a silent reassurance, passing from one heart to another. I am here. You are here. We are in this together. Sometimes, a hand would reach out. A young man with trembling fingers might struggle to unwrap a small piece of hard candy. The man beside him, without looking, would gently reach over, take the wrapper, and pry it open with steady hands before passing it back. A canteen would be offered in the dark, the cool metal cool against dry lips, moving down the line from hand to hand, a silent communion of shared thirst and shared comfort. These small, everyday kindnesses were the anchors that held them steady. In a world that was hurtling them forward into the vast unknown, these simple gestures of humanity were profound acts of love. They were the quiet, everyday heroism of simply being there for someone else when the night was dark. As the hours drifted by, the rhythm of the flight took on a hypnotic quality. The initial surge of adrenaline had faded, replaced by a heavy, dreamy exhaustion. The vibration of the floor, the deep hum of the propellers, the swaying of the hull, it all combined into a soothing, mechanical rocking. Many of the young men let their chins fall to their chests, surrendering to brief, fractured moments of sleep. In the dim red light, they looked incredibly peaceful. The lines of worry smoothed out, their breathing falling into a slow, synchronized rhythm that rose and fell in time with the gentle dips of the aircraft. In these quiet moments of rest, the mind wanders to beautiful things. They dreamed of ordinary afternoons. They dreamed of the sound of a screen door snapping shut on a lazy August evening. They dreamed of the taste of cold milk and fresh bread. They dreamed of the feeling of a clean, soft pillow beneath their heads, the kind where the cotton smells like sunshine and fresh wind. They gathered these gentle thoughts around themselves like cloaks, wrapping themselves in the warmth of ordinary life. It is a strange and beautiful thing, how in the moments of greatest uncertainty, the human heart does not crave grand adventures or sweeping dramas, it craves the quiet, simple poetry of the everyday. It craves the things that are soft, and safe, and known. Outside, the invisible ocean continued to roll beneath them, dark and deep. The air grew slightly cooler, a sign that they were moving away from the warming currents of the sea and approaching the unseen mass of the land. The subtle change in the air pressure, a faint shift in the pitch of the engines, signaled to the quiet minds in the cabin that the endless ocean was finally giving way to the edge of the continent. Yet, even as the destination drew nearer, the quiet inside the cabin remained unbroken. There was no rushing, no sudden panic. Just the slow, steady breathing of men who had made their peace with the night. They had spent these long hours in the dark preparing their hearts, folding their fears away like the letters in their pockets, carefully and with great tenderness. They had found strength in the rustling canvas of the man sitting beside them, courage in the shared glances in the dim ruby light, and profound peace in the beautiful, lingering memories of home. They were still suspended in that space between the stars and the earth, carried forward in the vibrating metal cocoon. The shadows over the channel were deep and long, hiding the world below in a blanket of absolute mystery. But inside, enveloped in the hum of the engines and the shared warmth of simply being together, they were not alone. They were a brotherhood of quiet thought, floating gently through the night sky, breathing in the cool air, holding on to their beautiful memories, and waiting, with graceful patience, for whatever the dawn might bring. Stepping into the endless dark, the world simply vanished, leaving only the cool rush of the wind and the quiet, steady beating of a single heart. Just moments before, there had been the crowded warmth of the transport plane, the reassuring pressure of a friend's shoulder, and the deep, hypnotic drone of the engines. But as each young man stepped through the open doorway, crossing the threshold from the heavy metal hull into the vast expanse of the night, all of that was instantly swept away. There was a sudden, breathless rush of cold air, a fleeting sensation of tumbling through the dark, and then, with a firm and gentle tug, the great silk canopy bloomed open against the stars. And then, there was silence. It was a sudden, profound quiet that felt almost sacred after the long hours of roaring engines. Up here, suspended halfway between the heavens and the earth, the war did not exist. There was only the gentle rustle of canvas, the soft, rhythmic creaking of the harness lines, and the quiet sigh of the wind moving through the dark fabric above. The parachute was a vast, protective shadow, a quiet umbrella shielding the young men from the immense emptiness of the sky. As they drifted downward, the chaotic drop reframed itself into an isolating, almost dreamlike descent. The violent speeds of the aircraft were replaced by a slow, swaying, pendulum motion. It was as if time itself had decided to pause, stretching these few minutes into an eternity of floating. The young men were no longer part of a great, moving army. They were suddenly, completely, and beautifully alone. Imagine the profound solitude of that moment. A boy from a crowded city or a bustling farmhouse, suddenly finding himself entirely unmoored from everything he had ever known, drifting through a foreign sky in the middle of the night. There was no one to talk to, no one to follow, no light to guide the way. Just the gentle sway of the silk in the vast, dark ocean of the air. Yet, in this deep loneliness, there was a strange and soothing comfort. The quiet offered a space to breathe, a fleeting sanctuary where a young man could gather his scattered thoughts and simply be. The heavy straps of the parachute harness gripped their shoulders and waists tight. It was a firm, grounding pressure. In the cold, weightless drift of the night sky, that pressure felt remarkably like an embrace, a steady, holding presence ensuring they would not simply float away into the stars. As they descended lower, the crisp, thin air of the higher altitudes gave way to the soft, damp embrace of the clouds. Thick, gray mists wrapped around them, obscuring the moon and hiding the earth below. Drifting through these clouds felt like moving through a dream. The air grew heavy with moisture, leaving tiny, glistening dewdrops on their eyelashes and dampening the rough wool of their collars. In this gray, enveloping fog, all sense of direction faded. There was only up, where the silk held them, and down, where the unknown waited. In this quiet isolation, the mind naturally reaches for what it loves most. Suspended in the mist, the young men closed their eyes and let their memories keep them warm. One soldier, swaying gently in the quiet dark, let his mind wander back to a wide, sunlit field in his childhood. He remembered holding a tightly wound spool of string, feeling the strong, lively tug of a paper kite dancing in the summer breeze. The pull of the parachute lines above him felt just like that kite, tethering him not to a war, but to the simple, joyous memories of home. Another young man, floating silently through the gray vapor, rested his gloved hand over the pocket of his jacket, just as he had done in the plane. He could not read the letter folded inside, but he didn't need to. In the absolute quiet of his descent, he could almost hear her voice speaking the words. He could hear the gentle lilt of her laughter, the soft, familiar cadence of her speech reading out the news of the neighborhood, the weather, the garden. Her voice became his anchor in the sky, a quiet melody that drowned out the fear of the fall. He held onto her words, letting them wrap around his heart like a protective shield. This is the quiet resilience of the human spirit. Even when dropped into the darkest and most uncertain of nights, these young men did not surrender to the void. They filled the empty sky with love. They populated the lonely air with the faces of their mothers, the smiles of their sweethearts, and the comforting memories of ordinary days. They carried their homes with them, held safely in the quiet sanctuaries of their minds, proving that even in the most isolating moments, we are never truly alone if we carry love with us. Slowly, gently, the thick blankets of cloud began to part. The mist thinned into wisps of gray, and the dark landscape of Normandy finally began to reveal itself below. The earth did not rush up to meet them with violence. Instead, it materialized softly, like a photograph slowly developing in a darkroom. As they slipped beneath the cloud cover, a new sensation washed over them. The sharp, salty smell of the ocean breeze that had carried them across the channel was suddenly replaced. Rising up from the darkness below was the rich, fragrant scent of the earth. It was the smell of damp soil turning over, of wet, crushed grass, and the faint, sweet perfume of sleeping apple orchards waiting for the dawn. It was a deeply comforting smell, an ancient and welcoming scent that spoke of life, of growth, and of enduring stillness. The Norman countryside lay beneath them like a patchwork quilt woven from shadows. The deep blacks of the ancient hedgerows formed a labyrinthine grid, outlining the softer, charcoal gray squares of the open pastures. In the faint, silvery light of the moon slipping through the clouds, the dew on the grass caught the reflection, making the fields shimmer like dark, quiet lakes. It was a landscape of deceptive peace, a sleeping world unaware of the quiet visitors drifting down from the stars. The descent slowed even further in the mind as the ground grew closer. The young men watched the earth gently rising up to catch them. There was a quiet anticipation now, a careful bending of the knees, a readying of the body to meet the soil. The dreamlike float was coming to an end, but the peace they had found in the sky remained tucked away in their hearts. They did not know what the dark fields held. They did not know how long it would take to find their friends, or what trials the morning would bring. But for this one, beautiful, suspended moment, none of that mattered. They were simply floating, cradled by the silk, guided by the gentle wind, and held warm by the memories they kept close. As the tops of the tall trees brushed past their boots, rustling the leaves in a quiet, welcoming whisper, they prepared to step back into the world. The silk above them gave one final, soft sigh as the tension left the lines. And with a gentle rustle of damp grass and the soft crunch of yielding earth, they returned to the ground, stepping out of the lonely, beautiful sky and into the quiet embrace of the Norman fields. The earth reached up to catch them, soft and wet, hiding them instantly in a world of deep, tangled shadows. When their heavy leather boots finally met the soil, there was no grand fanfare, no sudden rush of action, and no loud commands. There was only the gentle, yielding crunch of damp pasture grass and the soft, exhausted sigh of the silk canopy collapsing overhead, draping itself over the wild bushes like a resting ghost. After the roaring vibration of the transport planes and the lonely, suspended dream of the descent, the sudden solidity of the ground was a profound shock to the senses. The world had stopped moving. The wind had ceased its pulling. For a long, breathless moment, the young men simply knelt in the wet clover, letting the stillness of the night wash over them. The air here was completely different from the cold, thin atmosphere of the clouds. It was thick and fragrant, heavy with the deeply comforting smell of crushed leaves, damp soil, and the sweet, lingering perfume of sleeping apple orchards. It smelled like the deep, undisturbed woods of home after a long, heavy rain. As they worked with trembling fingers to unbuckle the heavy canvas straps of their harnesses, the dew from the tall grass quickly soaked through the knees of their wool trousers. It was a cold, sharp sensation, but it was also undeniably real. It was the physical proof that they had arrived, that the sky had let them go, and that they were safely back in the arms of the earth. But as the young men stepped out from under the folds of their collapsed parachutes, a new and entirely different kind of isolation began to settle over them. They were not falling anymore, but they were profoundly, deeply lost. The landscape of Normandy did not look like the flat, open training fields they had memorized on neatly drawn maps. In the pale, silvery light of the hidden moon, the world was a labyrinth. Rising up on all sides were the ancient hedgerows. They were not mere bushes or simple fences, but towering, formidable walls of earth, thick roots, twisted briars, and ancient oaks. They loomed in the darkness like sleeping giants, casting long, impenetrable shadows that swallowed the light. To a young man standing alone in a sunken lane, surrounded by these towering walls of foliage, the world felt incredibly small, closed in, and deeply secretive. Imagine the quiet fear of that moment. A boy, barely out of his teenage years, standing alone in a foreign field in the middle of the night. The absolute silence of the countryside pressed inward, heavy and expectant. Every rustle of a leaf, every snap of a twig beneath a shifting boot, sounded incredibly loud against the stillness. He did not know where he was. He did not know what lay behind the next wall of thorns. But most importantly, he did not know where his friends were. In the chaotic scatter of the drop, the tight-knit groups from the airplanes had been thrown to the winds, scattered like autumn leaves across miles of dark farmland. The boy in the sunken lane leaned his back against the damp earth of the hedgerow, trying to make himself as small as possible. He closed his eyes, listening so hard that his own heartbeat sounded like a drum in his ears. He just wanted to hear a familiar voice. He wanted to hear the comforting, casual drawl of the boy from Texas who always had a joke, or the quiet, steady breathing of his best friend who slept in the bunk below his. The loneliness in that dark, leafy corridor was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest, making the cool night air hard to breathe. Then, he remembered the small, cold shape resting deep in the pocket of his jacket. He reached inside, his gloved fingers wrapping around a tiny piece of stamped brass. It was a clicker, a simple, spring-loaded toy, no bigger than a matchbox. Back home, it was the kind of thing you might find at a county fair, a cheap trinket children used to annoy their parents on a long Sunday drive. It was so remarkably small, so entirely innocent, that holding it in the middle of this vast, imposing darkness felt almost absurd. Yet, this tiny, fragile piece of brass was his only tether to the boys he had lost in the sky. With a deep, shaky breath, he pressed his thumb down on the cool metal. Click-clack. The sound was sharp and metallic. It was not a loud noise, but it was distinctly unnatural. It did not belong to the rustling leaves, the shifting soil, or the gentle night breeze. It was a man-made sound, a tiny, brave question tossed out into the terrifying ocean of the dark. He released his breath and waited. The seconds stretched out, long and elastic. The quiet of the Norman night rushed back in to fill the space where the sound had been. A stray breeze moved through the top of the oak tree above him, making the branches sway and whisper. A small field mouse scurried through the dry leaves at his feet. But there was no answer. Doubt began to creep into the edges of his mind. Had he pressed it too softly? Was he entirely alone in this sector? He tightened his grip on the heavy wood of his rifle, feeling the chilling isolation return. He closed his eyes, picturing the warm, yellow light of his mother's kitchen back home, trying to wrap himself in the memory to keep the cold fear at bay. He brought the small brass toy up again, his thumb resting heavily on the metal tongue. He pressed it once more, a little firmer this time, pouring all his quiet desperation, all his longing for a friend, into that tiny motion. Click-clack. He held his breath, his eyes wide open, straining to see through the impenetrable blackness of the hedgerow across the lane. 1 second. 2 seconds. The wind sighed again. And then, from somewhere just beyond the thick tangle of roots and ivy, came a sound. Click-clack. Click-clack. It was the answering double snap. The relief that washed over the young man was so absolute, so physically overwhelming, that his knees nearly gave way beneath him. It was as if a heavy, invisible stone had been lifted from his shoulders. He was not alone. The world was no longer an endless, hostile void. There was someone else out there, another boy standing in the damp grass, holding the exact same child's toy, reaching back through the dark. He leaned forward, his eyes scanning the dense foliage. Flash, he whispered, his voice trembling just a little, barely louder than the rustling leaves. From the shadows across the lane, a voice drifted back, soft and deeply relieved. Thunder. A silhouette slowly detached itself from the darkness of the hedgerow. The shape moved carefully, stepping over the tangled roots, parting the low-hanging branches with a cautious hand. As the figure stepped into the pale moonlight filtering through the canopy, the young man recognized the familiar slope of the helmet, the bulky outline of the canvas webbing, and finally, the dirt-smudged, exhausted face of a friend. They did not shout. They did not cheer. The night was still too vast, and the unknown was still too close. But as they closed the distance between them, one reached out and gripped the other's shoulder. It was a fierce, tight grip, fingers digging into the heavy wool and canvas. It was a touch that said everything words could not. It said, "I was so afraid." It said, "I am so glad I found you." It said, "We are going to be all right, because we are together." They sank down together at the base of the ancient hedgerow, pressing their backs against the thick, protective roots. The boy who had crossed the lane reached for his canteen, unscrewing the cap with shaking hands. He took a small sip and passed it to his friend. The water was lukewarm and tasted faintly of metal, but in that moment, it was the sweetest thing he had ever swallowed. It was a shared communion, a quiet celebration of survival in the misty dark. Slowly, as the hours drifted by, the quiet echoes of the brass crickets continued to gently puncture the night. Click-clack. A pause. Click-clack. Click-clack. Out of the labyrinth of the shadows, they began to gather. One boy became two. Two became four. Small, quiet bands of brothers formed in the dew-soaked grass, drawn together by the gentle, metallic heartbeat of the clicking toys. They did not always know each other's names. They came from different planes, different towns, different lives. But sitting there in the damp clover, huddled together for warmth beneath the towering ancient trees, none of that mattered. They were united by the shared vulnerability of the drop, the profound relief of the reunion, and the quiet resilience of simply sitting beside another human being in the dark. They whispered in the shadows, their voices low and soothing. They asked about broken equipment, about the direction of the wind, about the distant, muffled sounds rolling across the countryside. But mostly, they just sat in the quiet companionship, drawing strength from the steady breathing of the men beside them. The fear had not completely vanished, but it had changed. It was no longer the sharp, paralyzing terror of absolute isolation. It was a shared burden now, dispersed among the group, made lighter by the simple presence of friends. As the deep velvet of the night began to slowly soften, hinting at the approach of morning, the young men rested their heads against the damp earth and closed their eyes for just a moment. They listened to the rustle of the leaves and the gentle shifting of their companions. They held their rifles close, but they kept their hands resting near the pockets that held the small brass crickets. Those tiny toys had guided them through the labyrinth, turning a terrifying, lonely descent into a story of reunion. In the quiet, dewy darkness of the Norman fields, they had found each other. And as they waited with graceful patience for the dawn's pale light to finally break over the hedgerows, they knew that whatever the morning asked of them, they would not have to face it alone. The night did not end all at once. It surrendered softly, melting away into a quiet, silver mist. For hours, the young men had lived in a world of absolute shadow, their entire universe narrowed down to the damp patch of earth beneath them and the reassuring shoulder of the friend leaning against their side. They had navigated the terrifying, ink-black labyrinth of the hedgerows, their hearts pounding a heavy rhythm against their ribs. But now, as the earth continued its slow, indifferent turn toward the sun, the deep velvet of the night began to thin. The edges of the sky, just above the distant line of the trees, bruised into a deep, soft purple, and then faded into a gentle, slate gray. The stars, which had felt like cold, distant companions through the lonely hours of the drop, began to blink out one by one, like tiny candles being gently blown out in a massive, quiet cathedral. A profound stillness settled over the world. It was that magical, breathless pause that happens just before the dawn, a moment when the wind completely dies down, the leaves stop their rustling, and the earth itself seems to close its eyes and rest before waking. In the sunken lanes and at the bases of the ancient, tangled roots, the young men watched the light slowly arrive. They were exhausted, a bone-deep weariness that made their limbs feel heavy and filled their minds with a hazy, drifting fog. The cold night air had seeped through the thick wool of their coats, leaving them shivering in the damp grass. But as the pale light began to filter through the canopy of leaves above them, a quiet, collective breath was released. They had survived the night. The terrible, unknown dark had not swallowed them whole. As the gray light swelled into a soft, pearlescent white, the landscape of Normandy finally revealed itself to them. It did not look like a battlefield. It did not look like a place of danger or sorrow. It was, simply and breathtakingly, beautiful. The terrifying, monstrous shapes that had loomed over them in the dark slowly softened back into ordinary trees and thick, overgrown bushes. The mist, which had felt so isolating during their descent, now clung to the hollows of the fields like a delicate, spun-glass blanket. Across the sprawling pastures, ancient apple orchards stood in quiet rows, their leaves heavy with the morning dew, glistening like thousands of tiny, clear jewels in the early light. In the distance, the faint, gentle slopes of rolling hills emerged, dotted with small, sleeping stone farmhouses with slate roofs that gleamed faintly with the moisture of the dawn. It was a landscape of profound, deceptive peace. The air was incredibly fresh, carrying the sweet, clean scent of wet clover, crushed ferns, and the distant, salty memory of the ocean. It was the kind of morning that belonged in a beautiful painting, or in a fond, fading memory of a childhood summer. For the young men sitting in the damp grass, this pastoral beauty was almost difficult to comprehend. They had crossed a dark ocean, tumbled through a lonely sky, and carried the heavy, metallic burdens of conflict into this quiet place. Yet, the earth greeted them not with hostility, but with a gentle, indifferent grace. A young man from the endless, flat plains of the Midwest leaned his head back against the thick, mossy trunk of an oak tree and let his eyes drift closed. For a brief, beautiful moment, he let himself pretend he was somewhere else entirely. The damp smell of the soil and the cool morning air reminded him so fiercely of home that it brought a sudden, tightening ache to his throat. He remembered the feeling of stepping out onto his family's back porch before the sun came up, the grass soaking his leather boots as he walked out to the barn to begin the day's chores. He remembered the quiet, comforting sounds of the animals rustling in the hay, and the warm, yellow glow of the kitchen window where his mother was just beginning to boil water for tea. He opened his eyes and looked at the young man sitting beside him, a boy from a crowded, bustling city, who was currently staring out at the apple orchard with a look of quiet wonder on his dirt-smudged face. "My mother will be putting the kettle on right about now," the boy from the Midwest whispered, his voice soft and raspy from the cold. The city boy turned his head, a slow, gentle smile touching the corners of his mouth. He didn't say anything at first. He just reached into one of the many canvas pouches on his belt, his fingers working clumsily at the heavy metal snap. He pulled out a small, foil-wrapped square of hard chocolate from his rations. Carefully, deliberately, he broke the square perfectly in half. He handed one piece to his friend, and kept the other for himself. "My folks are probably just turning off the radio," the city boy whispered back, popping the small piece of chocolate into his mouth. "Falling asleep with the window open to catch the breeze." They sat there in the pale light, sharing a quiet, unspoken communion. The chocolate was chalky and dry, but as it slowly melted on their tongues, it tasted like a tiny, fragile piece of home. It was a momentary escape, a gentle tether back to the world of ordinary mornings and quiet routines. In the grand sweep of history, two boys sharing a piece of candy in a damp field means very little. But in that moment, under the branches of an ancient tree, it was everything. It was a small, profound act of grace, a quiet rebellion of humanity against the heavy circumstances that surrounded them. Further down the tangled line of the hedgerow, the new light offered a different kind of comfort. A soldier, his hands still trembling slightly from the cold and the adrenaline of the night, reached into the breast pocket of his jacket. His fingers brushed past the rough wool and found the smooth, familiar fold of a photograph. In the dark, he had only been able to touch it, relying on memory to fill in the features. But now, in the soft, gray light of the dawn, he could truly see her again. He held the picture carefully by the edges, shielding it from the damp air with his cupped hand. The morning light caught the gentle curve of her smile, the way her hair fell across her shoulders, the bright, hopeful spark in her eyes. The edges of the paper were soft and frayed, carrying the invisible weight of being held 1,000 times before. He traced the outline of her face with his thumb, a touch so light it was almost a prayer. He noticed how the beautiful morning around him, the singing birds, the dew-soaked grass, the pale, luminous sky, somehow made the photograph feel even more precious. He was sitting in a world that looked so peaceful, yet his heart was incredibly heavy with the knowledge of what the day would inevitably ask of him. He looked at her face one last time, drawing a long, slow breath of the sweet, damp air, pulling the courage from her smile deep into his lungs. Then, with careful, deliberate reverence, he tucked the photograph back into his pocket, buttoning the flap securely over his heart. As the sun finally breached the distant horizon, the world underwent a breathtaking transformation. The pale, silver light suddenly caught fire, turning to a rich, liquid gold. The mist in the hollows burned away, and the long, dark shadows cast by the hedgerows began to slowly retreat. The first true rays of the morning sun filtered through the leaves, finding the exhausted faces of the young men. The warmth was immediate and profound. It touched their chilled shoulders, melted the frost from their helmets, and brought a sudden, returning flush of life to their pale skin. Several of the boys simply closed their eyes and tilted their faces upward, leaning into the light like flowers turning toward the sun. They sat in absolute silence, letting the golden warmth seep into their tired bones. It felt like a gentle hand resting on their shoulders, a quiet reassurance from the universe itself. With the rising sun came the subtle, inevitable shift in the atmosphere. The protective cloak of the night was gone. The world was awake now, and the quiet sanctuary they had found at the base of the trees could not hold them forever. There were no shouted orders to break the spell of the morning. There was only a slow, collective realization that the time for resting had passed. The young men began to move, their actions deliberate and hushed. They wiped the dark, damp soil from their faces with the backs of their sleeves, revealing the young, tired eyes beneath. They checked their heavy canvas webbing, pulling straps tight, their hands moving with quiet, practiced efficiency. When a canteen was lifted, a hand would naturally cup the metal chain to silence the clink against the aluminum body, desperate not to shatter the delicate peace of the morning. When a boy struggled to stand, his legs cramped from hours of sitting in the cold damp, the boy next to him would silently offer a hand, pulling him up from the grass with a firm, steadying grip. They stood together in the golden light, a small, quiet fellowship of boys who had become men in the dark. They looked out at the beautiful, deceptive pastures of Normandy, taking one final, deep breath of the innocent morning air. The heavy task they had been sent to do was out there, waiting somewhere beyond the blooming apple trees and the moss-covered walls. But as they finally stepped away from the protective shadow of the hedgerow, moving out into the dawn's pale light, they did not walk with panic or despair. They walked with a quiet, incredible resilience. They carried the warmth of the sun on their shoulders, the sweet taste of shared chocolate on their tongues, and the faces of the people they loved pressed safely against their hearts. The morning was beautiful, and the day would be long, but as they moved forward into the mist, they moved together, stepping softly, gracefully, into whatever waited for them in the light. In the shadow of a weathered stone wall, the fate of an entire morning was drawn with a simple wooden stick in the soft, dry earth. The farmyard where they finally paused was incredibly peaceful, a forgotten pocket of time hidden away behind the towering hedgerows. It was a humble place, framed by an ancient, sloping barn with a roof of moss-covered slate and a low stone wall that looked as though it had stood there for 100 years, quietly watching the seasons change. The morning sun was just beginning to climb higher into the pale sky, casting long, warm, golden rectangles of light across the dirt courtyard. In these beams of light, thousands of tiny dust motes danced and floated, drifting on the sluggish morning breeze like microscopic stars. It was a place meant for the gentle sounds of ordinary life, the clucking of hens, the heavy, rhythmic thud of a horse's hooves, the creak of a wooden cart, or the bright laughter of children playing in the hay. Instead, the farmyard was filled with a profound, exhausted silence. Gathering slowly within the protective embrace of the stone walls was a small, mismatched group of young men. They had emerged from the labyrinth of the damp hedgerows one by one, or in quiet pairs, guided by the clicking of their brass toys and the desperate hope of finding a familiar face. They did not look like the pristine, uniformed soldiers you might see in a grand parade. The night had taken away their neatness, leaving them beautifully, fragilely human. Their heavy canvas trousers were stained at the knees with the dark, rich mud of the Norman pastures. Their faces were smudged with burnt cork in the dust of the fields, their eyes deeply shadowed by the lack of sleep and the heavy emotional toll of the lonely descent. Some of these boys knew each other intimately. They had shared bunks, traded letters from home, and laughed through the long, tedious months of training across the ocean. Others were strangers, boys from different airplanes who had simply gravitated toward the comforting presence of another human being in the dark. Yet, standing there in the sunlit farmyard, the differences vanished. They were bound together by the shared miracle of having survived the night. They moved with a slow, deliberate tenderness, careful not to break the quiet of the morning. One young man leaned heavily against a wooden fence post, his head resting on his arms, his chest rising and falling in a deep, rhythmic slumber that he stole while standing up. Beside him, another boy sat on a fallen log, carefully unlacing a heavy leather boot. The boy sitting next to him reached over, without being asked, and offered his own canteen. The first boy took it, offering a small, grateful nod, the metal cool and soothing against his dry lips. There were no grand declarations of brotherhood here, only these tiny, fragile moments of everyday grace. They were a flock of lost birds who had finally found a safe branch to rest upon, if only for a fleeting moment. From among this quiet, exhausted group, a single figure stepped forward into the center of the dusty courtyard. He was a young man, scarcely older than the boys he was about to address. His own uniform was just as damp, his own eyes just as tired, and his heart held the very same memories of home and peace that they all carried. But as he moved into the sunlight, a subtle, profound shift occurred. It was not a physical transformation, but an invisible settling of weight. He was a quiet leader, a man who did not need to shout to be heard, and who did not demand respect, but rather gently gathered it through the steady, calming gravity of his presence. He looked around the circle of faces, taking a moment to truly see each one of them. He saw the boy from the crowded city who was nervously twisting a loose thread on his canvas webbing. He saw the quiet farm boy who was staring softly at the ground, perhaps thinking of a wide, open field far away. The leader felt a sudden, profound ache in his chest. It was the crushing, beautiful burden of responsibility. He knew, with a quiet certainty, that each of these boys was the entire world to someone else. Somewhere across the ocean, mothers were setting extra plates at the dinner table out of habit, fathers were listening anxiously to the static of the radio, and sweethearts were tracing the ink on old letters. And now, the lives of these deeply loved boys rested softly, heavily, in his hands. He had not asked for this burden. He had simply been the one who emerged from the dark with the clearest mind and the quietest heart, the one willing to carry the weight so the others wouldn't have to. He swallowed hard, pushing the fear down into a small, private box within his heart, locking it away so that his men would only see his calm. With a slow, fluid motion, the quiet leader knelt in the dust of the farmyard. He did not unfold a crisp, paper map. He did not point to a perfectly drawn diagram. Instead, he reached out and picked up a small, withered twig from the ground. It was a simple piece of wood, stripped of its bark, smooth and ordinary. The men noticed the movement. Slowly, naturally, they began to gather around him. They did not form rigid lines or stand at formal attention. They simply drifted closer, drawn by the invisible tether of trust, forming a tight, intimate semicircle around the kneeling figure. They leaned in close, resting their hands on their knees, their breathing synchronizing into a single, soft rhythm. With the tip of the twig, the leader touched the soft earth. Scrape. He drew a long, shallow line in the dust. The dry soil curled away from the wood, leaving a small, neat groove. This, he said, his voice barely louder than a whisper, yet carrying clearly in the absolute stillness of the courtyard, is the tree line. He moved the stick a few inches away, drawing a slightly thicker, curving line. The men watched the tip of the wood intently, their eyes tracking the gentle disruption of the dust. And this is the hedgerow. The one we just crossed. He did not use complicated terminology. He did not speak of grand strategy or vast movements of armies. He spoke in the simple, grounded language of the earth right in front of them. He was translating the terrifying unknown into something they could see, something they could understand, something small enough to fit inside a dusty farmyard. With careful, deliberate strokes, he pressed the twig deeper into the dirt, making 4 distinct marks in a row. They were just small, uneven crosses in the dust, but as he drew them, the air in the circle seemed to grow very still. Right here, the leader whispered softly, pointing to the marks, hidden behind the brush, are the heavy guns. He paused, letting the words settle. Across the quiet fields, they had all heard the distant, rhythmic thudding of those machines, a low, mechanical heartbeat that was throwing invisible fire toward the beaches where thousands of other boys just like them, were stepping out of the cold ocean water. Our job, the leader continued, his voice as steady and comforting as a hand resting on a trembling shoulder, is to make them stop. He looked up from the drawing, letting his eyes meet the gaze of the men standing around him. He didn't offer a speech about glory or history. Those concepts were too vast, too cold to hold on to in a moment like this. He simply offered them honesty. He explained the path they would take, the quiet way they would move through the rustling leaves, and how they would rely entirely on each other. He traced the final path in the dust, an arrow pointing directly toward the crosses. The map was complete. It was primitive, a child's drawing sketched in the dirt, temporary and fragile. The next strong breeze would smooth it away, erasing the lines as if they had never been there at all. Yet, for these few minutes, it was the most important document in the world. It was a blueprint for their survival. The silence that followed his explanation was incredibly deep. The leader stayed kneeling for a moment, letting the men process the weight of what lay ahead. He did not rush them. He understood that a man needs a quiet second to gather his courage, to fold away his hopes and his letters, and to step across the invisible line between resting and moving forward. Slowly, gently, the resolve began to settle over the group. It was not a fiery, loud determination. It was a quiet, profound acceptance. The boy from the city, the one who had shared his chocolate earlier, gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He didn't look away from the drawing in the dirt. He just nodded, accepting the path. Beside him, another young man took a slow, deep breath of the morning air, holding it in his lungs for a second before letting it out in a soft sigh. A hand reached out and gave a reassuring squeeze to a friend's shoulder. They looked at the young man kneeling in the dust. They saw his calm eyes, the steady line of his jaw, and the gentle, unyielding care he had for every single one of them. In that moment, a beautiful, invisible transaction took place. They handed him their absolute trust, and in return, he gave them a sense of profound, quiet purpose. They didn't know if they would all come back to this farmyard. They didn't know what the hidden trenches held. But they knew they were not walking into the dark alone. They had a guide, they had each other, and they had a map drawn in the dust. The leader finally stood up, brushing the dry soil from the knees of his trousers. The simple motion was a signal. All around the circle, hands moved with quiet, deliberate grace. Canteens were shifted to the small of the back so they wouldn't rattle. The heavy canvas straps of their gear were pulled tight across their chests. The metallic click of a clasp being fastened sounded impossibly loud, yet deeply reassuring. It was the sound of preparation, the sound of boys putting away their childhoods to do a remarkably heavy thing. A young man near the back of the group reached a gloved hand up to his chest one last time. He pressed his fingers against the breast pocket where his mother's letter lay folded, feeling the faint outline of the paper through the rough wool. He closed his eyes, sending a silent, whispered promise into the morning air, a promise that he would do his best to make it back to read it again. Then, he lowered his hand, his expression softening into a mask of quiet determination. The leader took a step toward the edge of the farmyard, moving out of the golden sunlight and back toward the shadows of the ancient hedgerows. He did not look back to see if they were following. He knew they were. One by one, the young men turned and followed him, stepping carefully over the map in the dust, their heavy boots leaving fresh prints in the dry earth. They moved quietly, a silent procession of brothers woven together by trust and the cool morning air. Behind them, the farmyard returned to its deep, ancient slumber. The golden light continued to warm the stone walls, the dust motes danced lazily in the sunbeams, and a gentle breeze swept across the courtyard, slowly and softly smoothing away the lines in the dirt, leaving only the quiet memory of the men who had gathered there. To step into the deep, tangled shadows of the ancient trees was to become, for a fleeting morning hour, a ghost moving softly through the leaves. Leaving the warm, golden light of the dusty farmyard, the small line of young men slipped back into the labyrinth of the Norman countryside. The transition was immediate and profound. The open sky above them was quickly swallowed by a thick, weaving canopy of oak branches, twisted vines, and heavy ivy. They were swallowed by the hedgerows, entering a sunken lane that felt less like a path and more like a long, emerald tunnel. The air here was cooler, sheltered from the rising sun, and it smelled richly of dark moss, wet stone, and centuries of undisturbed earth. They moved with a deliberate, agonizing slowness. Every single step was a conscious decision, a careful negotiation with the ground beneath their boots. In the normal world, walking is something we do without thinking, a simple rhythm of falling and catching ourselves. But here, in the quiet hush of the morning, walking became a delicate art. The ground was littered with the brittle, fallen leaves of the previous autumn, hiding dry twigs and loose stones that could snap and shatter the delicate silence. To prevent this, the men transformed themselves. They lowered their center of gravity, bending their knees slightly, letting the heavy weight of their canvas gear settle onto their hips. They watched the heels of the man directly in front of them, placing their own boots exactly where his had been, trusting that he had already found the safe, silent patches of earth. It was a strange, silent dance, a synchronized movement of shadows gliding through the underbrush. Near the middle of the quiet procession, a young man from the dense, pine-covered mountains of the Pacific Northwest found a strange, comforting familiarity in the task. As he carefully rolled his foot from the outside edge to the toe, feeling for hidden branches before committing his weight, his mind drifted miles and years away. He was no longer carrying a heavy steel helmet and a canvas webbing full of brass. Instead, he was back in the deep, mist-shrouded forests of his childhood, trailing behind his father on a quiet November morning. He remembered the smell of the damp pine needles, the gentle, patient smile on his father's face as he turned around and placed a finger to his lips, teaching his son the ancient, respectful way to walk through the woods without disturbing the creatures that lived there. The memory was so vivid, so beautifully clear, that he could almost feel the rough wool of his father's plaid hunting jacket brushing against his cheek. He took a slow breath of the Norman air, blending the scent of French oak with the phantom scent of American pine. It was a gentle comfort, a reminder that the skills of peace could carry him safely through the trials of the morning. As they pressed deeper into the foliage, a new sensation began to thread its way through the quiet. It did not start as a sound, but rather as a feeling, a faint, rhythmic vibration trembling through the soles of their boots and echoing faintly in the hollow cavities of their chests. Thump! A long, drawn-out pause, filled only by the rustling of leaves and the soft breathing of the men. Thump! It was the heavy guns. Hidden somewhere ahead, camouflaged within the pastoral beauty of the fields, the machines were awake. The sound was not a sharp crack or a deafening roar. Because of the distance and the thick, baffling walls of earth and vegetation, the noise was muffled, transformed into a low, resonant thud. It sounded like the slow, steady heartbeat of a sleeping giant resting beneath the soil. With every muffled thud, the leaves on the bushes seemed to shiver. The young men felt it too. It was a constant, rhythmic reminder of their purpose. But strangely, as the sound grew steadily more pronounced, it did not incite panic. Instead, it brought a solemn, grounding focus. The abstract idea of the mission, the lines drawn in the dust of the farmyard, were now a tangible, physical reality. They listened to the heavy, mechanical rhythm, and their thoughts naturally drifted toward the coast. Miles away, out of sight and down by the edge of the cold ocean, thousands of other boys were stepping off metal boats into the water. Those boys were strangers. They had different names, grew up on different streets, and carried different letters in their pockets. Yet, every single time that distant, heavy thud rolled across the fields, the men in the hedgerow knew it was reaching toward the water. There is a profound, quiet heroism in walking deliberately toward a dangerous sound to protect someone you have never met. The young men in the green tunnel did not speak of it, but it sat heavily in their hearts. They were carrying the safety of those unseen brothers on their own tired shoulders. It was a burden of pure, unconditional love, disguised beneath dirt-smudged faces and damp canvas uniforms. They moved a little more carefully, stepping a little more softly, determined to silence the heavy heartbeat in the field so that the boys on the beaches could simply stand up and walk onto the sand. The physical toll of the slow, tense movement began to show. Despite the cool shade of the canopy, beads of sweat gathered at the napes of their necks and trickled slowly down their temples. Holding the body in such tight, controlled precision required a massive, silent effort. Muscles ached from the slow, deliberate lifting of heavy boots. The thick canvas straps dug into their collarbones. Suddenly, the leader at the front of the line stopped. He raised a single, leather-gloved hand into the air, holding it perfectly still. The command traveled down the line instantly, not with a shout, but with the soft, rustling accordion effect of bodies pausing. The young man from the Pacific Northwest stopped mid-step, holding his breath, balancing his weight carefully on one leg. The boy behind him, a quiet kid with round glasses who had lost his helmet in the night drop, bumped gently into his back. It was a tiny collision, just a soft brush of canvas against canvas, but in the amplified silence of the hedgerow, it felt significant. The boy with the glasses immediately reached out, placing a warm, trembling hand flat against the back of the man in front of him. It was an instinctual apology, but it lingered for a second longer than necessary. Through the thick fabric of his jacket, the man in front felt the gentle pressure of that hand. He didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He just slowly lowered his raised foot to the ground, leaned back a fraction of an inch into the touch, and offered a silent acknowledgement. In a world where they had to be completely quiet, where they had to suppress every natural urge to speak or call out, these small, physical points of contact became their entirely new language. That hand on the back said, "I am sorry." It said, "I am right here behind you." It said, "We are still together." The leader lowered his hand, and the line began to move again, drifting forward like a wisp of smoke caught in a slow breeze. The sunken lane began to curve, following the ancient property lines of the farms. The hedgerows grew thicker here, weaving together so tightly that the sunlight was completely choked out, leaving them in a perpetual, dusky twilight. Long, delicate strands of spiderwebs, silver with morning dew, stretched across the path. The men gently pushed them aside with the cold barrels of their rifles, careful not to break the delicate threads if they could help it. They were visitors in this ancient place, intruders slipping through the architecture of the natural world. The rhythmic thudding of the hidden artillery was closer now. It no longer felt like a vibration in the earth, it felt like a displacement of the air itself. With each muffled blast, a small gust of wind seemed to push through the leaves, carrying with it a faint, bitter scent that did not belong in the sweet morning air, the sharp, chemical smell of burnt powder and heated iron. They were nearing the edge. The map drawn in the dust was becoming a reality of roots, soil, and shadow. The men instinctively tightened their grips. Knuckles turned white beneath the smudges of dirt. A young man near the front closed his eyes for a long, slow blink, murmuring a quiet, soundless prayer into the collar of his jacket. He asked for steady hands. He asked for a quiet heart. He asked that if the universe was listening, it might watch over the beautiful, ordinary home he had left behind, just in case he could not return to it. He opened his eyes, the world still green and shadowed, and took another soft step forward. There were ghosts in the hedgerow, carrying the heavy weight of the world with impossible gentleness. They did not rush. They did not run. They simply let the shadows swallow them as they walked toward the sound, a quiet fellowship of young men stepping softly to the very edge of the leaves, where the hidden world was waiting to be revealed. The world narrowed down to a single, trembling leaf, and the heavy secret it was hiding just on the other side. For what felt like an eternity, the young man had been completely enveloped in the deep, green isolation of the hedgerow tunnel. They had walked as shadows, guided only by the muffled, rhythmic thudding that shook the morning dew from the ancient branches above them. But now, that tunnel was ending. The dense, woven wall of roots and briars began to thin, letting the bright, golden light of the early sun spill through the gaps in a scattered, beautiful mosaic. The leader of the small group slowed his pace until he was barely moving at all, gracefully lowering himself down onto the damp earth. One by one, the quiet line of boys behind him did the same. They crawled the final few yards. The ground was soft and forgiving beneath them, fragrant with the smell of crushed clover and the rich, dark history of the soil. They pressed their chests against the earth, their heavy canvas uniforms absorbing the cool moisture of the morning. Moving with agonizing care, they inched forward until they were right at the very edge of the foliage, at the boundary between their hidden sanctuary and the open field. Slowly, gently, a young man reached up with a gloved hand. His fingers, trembling ever so slightly, found a thick, leafy branch of a hawthorn bush. With a motion as delicate as turning the fragile page of a very old book, he parted the leaves just enough to look through. What they saw in that moment caused a single, collective breath to be drawn and held across the entire line of men. The map drawn in the dusty farmyard had been a quiet, abstract thing. A few shallow lines scratched with a twig. But here, through the opening in the leaves, the abstract became remarkably, heavily real. The pastoral beauty of the Norman pasture had been deeply scarred. Carved into the gentle slope of the field, stretching out like a jagged, earthen maze, was a complex network of deep trenches. The fresh soil, turned over and exposed to the sky, was a dark, rich brown, contrasting sharply with the bright, cheerful green of the untouched grass that surrounded it. And nestled within those deep earthen pockets sat the source of the rhythmic heartbeat that had guided them through the dark. There were massive shapes of heavy, dark iron, camouflaged meticulously beneath wide, sprawling nets woven with strips of burlap and freshly cut branches. From a distance, they might have looked like strange, unnatural hills. But from the edge of the hedgerow, the young man could clearly see the long, cold barrels pointing up toward the sky, angled perfectly toward the distant, unseen ocean. To look upon them was to feel a sudden, profound smallness. These were not the simple, familiar tools of home. They were massive, intricate machines of extraordinary weight. And yet, there was a strange, terrible stillness to the scene. The camouflage knitting swayed gently in the morning breeze, much like the apple blossoms in the orchard just beyond. The air carried the sweet scent of the trees, now heavily laced with the sharp, bitter tang of burnt powder, a smell that stung the back of the throat and made the eyes water. Behind the hawthorn bush, the young man who had parted the leaves slowly let his hand drop. He rested his forehead against the damp soil, closing his eyes tightly. His heart was beating so fiercely against his ribs that he was certain the earth itself must be vibrating with the sound of it. He was a boy who had spent his entire life in a quiet, coastal town, where the loudest sound on a Tuesday morning was the distant whistle of a ferry boat. He had never seen anything like the deep, scarred earth before him. The sheer reality of it, the undeniable proof that they had finally arrived at the place they had been sent to find, washed over him in a wave of quiet, overwhelming realization. He did not want to stand up. He wanted to stay right there, pressed against the comforting, familiar soil, hidden beneath the canopy of leaves forever. It is a deeply human instinct to want to remain in the shadows when the light reveals something too heavy to carry. But as he lay there, struggling to steady his breathing, he felt a subtle, reassuring pressure against his side. The boy lying next to him, a quiet lad with a gentle smile who had shared a canteen in the dark hours of the night, had shifted his weight just enough so that their shoulders were firmly touching. It was not a push. It was not a command to move. It was simply an anchor. That small, physical connection grounded him. It was a silent transmission of courage, a reminder that while the machines in the field were vast and cold, the boys in the brush were warm, and breathing, and entirely together. The young man from the coastal town opened his eyes. He took a long, slow breath of the complex morning air, letting the scent of the apple blossoms wash over the bitter smell of the powder. He turned his head slightly, meeting the eyes of his friend. They shared a long, silent look. No grand promises were made, no heroic words were whispered. Just a simple, profound nod of understanding. I see it too. And I am still here with you. All along the edge of the hedgerow, similar moments of quiet reckoning were taking place. Further down the line, a young man with a spray of freckles across his nose was staring intently at the fresh dirt piled high along the edges of the trench. His father was a farmer, a man who spoke to the land with his hands and understood the seasons by the color of the soil. The boy looked at the turned earth and felt a sudden, poignant ache in his chest. To him, soil was meant for planting. It was meant to hold seeds, to catch the spring rain, to nurture life upward toward the sun. Seeing it carved open and used as a shield for heavy iron felt deeply sad to him. To cope with the heavy emotion, he reached his fingers down to the hem of his jacket. Sewn into the inner lining, hidden away from the damp and the dirt, was a tiny, embroidered square of fabric. It was a piece of a quilt his grandmother had been making when he left home. He rubbed the soft cotton between his thumb and forefinger, feeling the delicate, precise stitches she had made with her aging, gentle hands. He focused all of his attention on the softness of that fabric. He let his mind travel along the threads, back across the ocean, into a quiet, sunlit sitting room that smelled of peppermint and old wood. He stayed there for just a moment, gathering the love that had been stitched into that tiny square, using it to wrap a protective layer around his fragile, beating heart. The quiet leader, the one who had drawn the map in the dust, moved slowly down the line of men. He did not walk, he slid gracefully along the ground, making no more noise than a falling leaf. He stopped beside each boy, if only for a few seconds. He didn't issue new orders. He simply placed a firm, steadying hand on a shoulder or offered a calm, reassuring smile. He was checking the tether that bound them all together, making sure it was strong enough to hold them when they finally had to stand. He understood the profound weight of this pause. This was the threshold. For months, they had trained. For hours, they had traveled through the sky and the dark. But all of it, the airplanes, the parachutes, the long walk through the sunken lane, was simply the journey to the threshold. Crossing it was something entirely different. To cross the threshold meant leaving the protective shadows of the ancient trees. It meant standing up in the golden morning light and stepping out into the open pasture, exposing themselves completely to the vast, beautiful, and deeply indifferent sky. It was a moment that required an extraordinary act of will. It required a boy to actively decide to put his own life gently aside for the sake of the men beside him, and for the sake of the unseen boys waiting on the beaches far below. As the men lay there, peering through the foliage, the chaotic rush of adrenaline that had carried them through the night began to fade. In its place, a deep, settling calm began to take root. It was not the absence of fear. The fear was still there, sitting quietly in their stomachs, but it was a mastery of it. It was the quiet, dignified acceptance of the morning's heavy task. They checked their gear one last time, their movements incredibly slow and deliberate. A trembling hand smoothed a canvas strap. A thumb carefully wiped a smudge of dirt from the face of a compass. Someone took a final, small sip from a metal canteen, letting the lukewarm water rest on his tongue before swallowing. These were the gentle, grounding rituals of men preparing to leave the sanctuary of the known. The morning air grew perfectly still. The distant thudding continued, but the men in the brush no longer simply listened to it, they felt the rhythm of it in their own veins. They had memorized the landscape. They had seen the trenches, the turned earth, the camouflaged nets swaying softly in the breeze. They had looked their fear in the eye, and they had found the quiet resilience to hold its gaze. The leader returned to the center of the line. He looked out through the leaves one last time, his eyes sweeping over the quiet, scarred pasture. Then, he looked back at his men. He saw the way they were holding themselves, the gentle rise and fall of their shoulders as they breathed in unison. He saw the quiet resolve that had settled over their dirt-smudged faces. They were no longer lost boys wandering in the dark. They were a unified, beautiful force of quiet heroism, bound together by love, by duty, and by the profound trust they had placed in one another. He gave a slow, single nod. It was a gentle movement, but it carried the weight of the entire morning. The collective held breath was slowly, softly released, drifting out through the hawthorn leaves and disappearing into the cool air. The men pressed their hands firmly against the damp soil, feeling the ancient strength of the earth beneath them one final time. The time for looking was over. The threshold was waiting, and together, with quiet hearts and steady hands, they prepared to cross it. There is a space between a heartbeat and a footstep where the entire world seems to hold its breath. For the young men lying side by side at the very edge of the hawthorn bushes, time had entirely lost its meaning. The leader had given his quiet, solitary nod, the unspoken signal that the waiting was over, yet in the immediate seconds that followed, no one moved. It was a profound, elastic pause. In real, measured time, it was perhaps only a handful of seconds, but within the hearts and minds of the boys pressed against the damp Norman soil, it stretched out into a long, quiet eternity. This was the precipice. This was the fleeting, sacred threshold between the safety of the shadows and the profound vulnerability of the open field. To step out from beneath the canopy of ancient leaves meant leaving behind the final comforts of the natural world. It meant stepping away from the damp earth that smelled so fiercely of home, away from the quiet rustle of the branches that felt like a protective embrace, and away from the heavy, green stillness that had sheltered them since the dawn. Out there, in the bright, golden light of the morning, lay the harsh geometry of the trenches and the cold, heavy iron of the guns. In this suspended moment, the air around them felt incredibly thick, as if the morning mist had settled directly into their lungs. The men did not speak. They did not need to. Instead, they engaged in the quiet, deeply human rituals of preparation, small physical movements that anchored their wandering minds to the present moment. Down the line, a young boy with dirt smudged across his pale cheeks slowly reached up to his chin. His fingers, clad in worn leather gloves, found the canvas strap of his helmet. With an agonizingly slow, deliberate motion, he unfastened the small metal buckle, adjusted the webbing by a fraction of an inch, and pressed the clasp closed again. It was an entirely unnecessary adjustment. The helmet had fit perfectly all night. But the simple, repetitive motion of his hands, the familiar click of the metal, offered a tiny island of control in an ocean of terrifying uncertainty. It was a way of telling his own trembling hands that they were still his, that they still knew how to work, how to hold, how to fasten. Beside him, another soldier was tending to his rifle. He did not grip the weapon with white-knuckled panic. Instead, he held it across his chest almost tenderly, the way a musician might hold an instrument before stepping out onto a quiet stage. He ran his thumb back and forth over the smooth, oiled grain of the wooden stock. He felt the history of the wood, the way it had been polished by the countless, nervous touches of his own hands during long, lonely nights across the ocean. He rested his finger lightly against the cold steel of the safety catch, not moving it, just feeling the solid, mechanical promise of it beneath his skin. These were the things they knew. These were the heavy, tangible objects that tethered them to the earth when their fears threatened to carry them away into the sky. In this quiet space before the plunge, the mind does not dwell on grand philosophies or the sweeping currents of history. It retreats to the smallest, most intimately beautiful corners of memory. A young man from a quiet, dusty town in the American Southwest closed his eyes, shutting out the sight of the French pasture. For a fleeting second, he was standing on the wooden porch of his childhood home. He could feel the dry, warm evening wind brushing against his face. He could hear the faint, comforting creak of the porch swing swaying on its rusty chains, and the soft, rhythmic hum of the cicadas singing in the tall grass. He gathered this memory tightly around himself, a warm, invisible quilt against the chill of the morning. He breathed in the scent of the hawthorn leaves, but in his mind, he was breathing in the scent of dry earth and sagebrush. He knew he could not stay on that porch. He knew he had to open his eyes and face the pasture. But carrying that porch swing with him, carrying the song of the cicadas in his heart, made the heavy order feel just a little bit lighter. Further down the line, a soldier pressed his forearm against his chest, right over the pocket of his jacket. The paper inside crackled ever so softly, a tiny, fragile sound completely lost beneath the distant, rhythmic thud of the hidden artillery. He did not need to read the letter to know what it said. He simply closed his eyes and let the final 2 words of the ink wash over his mind. Love always. He wore those words like a shield. They could not stop the iron, and they could not silence the noise of the world, but they could protect the softest, most vital part of his spirit. Love always. It was a promise made across thousands of miles of dark water, and it was the very reason he was willing to stand up in the grass. As the seconds drifted by, a beautiful, silent language began to pass between the men. Without turning their heads, they began to seek out the eyes of the boys lying next to them. The boy from the crowded city slowly turned his gaze to the left, finding the quiet farm boy who had shared his piece of chocolate just an hour before. Their eyes met through the tangled leaves. The city boy's face was drawn tight, a small muscle feathering at the corner of his jaw, his breath coming in shallow, careful pulls. The farm boy did not offer a wide, confident smile, for that would have been a lie. Instead, he offered something far more profound. He simply blinked, a slow, gentle lowering of his eyelids, and offered a soft, imperceptible nod. It was a look that carried the weight of an entire conversation. It said, I know you are terrified. I am terrified too. It said, look at the sun on the grass, look at how beautiful the morning is, even here, even now. It said, when you stand, I will stand with you. When you step forward, my boot will fall right beside yours. The city boy's shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. The tight feathering in his jaw smoothed away. He took a deep, full breath, drawing the quiet strength of his friend directly into his own lungs. This was the quiet heroism of the morning. It was not found in loud shouts or fearless charges. It was found in the gentle pressure of a hand resting briefly over a trembling wrist. It was found in the sharing of a lukewarm canteen. It was found in a single, steadying glance exchanged through the shadows of a hawthorn bush. They were weaving an invisible safety net out of pure, human empathy, catching each other before they even had a chance to fall. At the very front of the line, the quiet leader laid perfectly still. He felt the eyes of his men resting softly upon his back. He knew they were watching his shoulders, waiting for the first flex of muscle, the first subtle shift of weight that would signal the end of the pause. The burden he carried in those fleeting seconds was unimaginably heavy. He was asking these boys, these young men with mothers and sweethearts and letters in their pockets, to follow him out of the safe embrace of the earth and into the chaotic unknown. He pressed his palms flat against the soft soil, feeling the dampness of the dew seeping through his gloves. He felt a profound, aching love for the men behind him. He wished, with every fiber of his being, that he could leave them safely hidden in the leaves, that he could walk out into the pasture alone and carry the entire weight of the morning on his own 2 shoulders. But he knew he could not. The task was too large. The hidden heartbeat of the guns was too heavy. They had to cross the threshold together, or not at all. He took one final, long breath. He inhaled the scent of the crushed clover, the bitter tang of the distant smoke, the sweet perfume of the apple blossoms hanging in the air. He let the morning fill him up completely, holding it inside his chest for one precious heartbeat. He made his peace with the shadows. He made his peace with the leaves. Slowly, with a grace that belonged to a dancer rather than a soldier, the leader began to shift. The movement was incredibly smooth, betraying none of the heavy effort it required. He drew his knee upward, the damp canvas of his trousers making a soft, whispering sound against the grass. He placed his boot firmly on the earth, finding a solid, quiet patch of soil. He pushed his weight forward, lifting his chest away from the ground. The spell of the pause was broken. The suspended eternity shattered softly, raining down around them like dust motes in the sun. All along the line, the men mirrored his movement. It was a fluid, synchronized wave of quiet rising. Hands pressed against the earth. Knees bent. Shoulders lifted. The rustle of the leaves grew slightly louder as the men separated themselves from the brush, pulling their bodies upward into the golden light. They did not rush. They moved with the deliberate, heavy dignity of men who fully understand the gravity of their own choices. They checked their gear one last time, a final pat of a pocket, a final brush of a thumb against smooth wood. They looked at the sun, they looked at the trenches, and they looked at each other. The weight of the order had been accepted. The fears had been carefully folded away, tucked behind the love and the letters. The fleeting seconds of stillness had given them the quiet sanctuary they needed to gather their souls. And now, moving as a single, breathing entity, the young men stepped out from the shadows of the hawthorn bushes, leaving the protective embrace of the hedgerow behind, and walked softly into the morning light. To leave the open sky and sink into the scarred earth is to let the world entirely disappear, leaving nothing but the damp soil and the ragged, quiet breath of the boy just ahead of you. When the young men finally slipped over the edge of the pasture and down into the carved depths of the trench, the bright, golden morning was instantly left behind. It was not a sudden, violent drop, but a slow, careful sliding down a steep bank of freshly turned clay. Their heavy leather boots sought purchase in the soft mud, their canvas-gloved hands reaching out to press against the cool, dark walls of the earth to steady their descent. As they sank below the level of the surrounding field, the vast, beautiful expanse of Normandy vanished. The sprawling apple orchards, the ancient, towering hedgerows, the pale blue morning sky, all of it was swallowed by the high earthen walls that now rose up on either side of them. The transition was startling in its quiet intimacy. Above them, the sky was reduced to a narrow, winding ribbon of pale light. Around them, the world was composed entirely of soil, shadow, and the soft, rustling movements of their friends. The air inside the trench was profoundly different from the sweet, flower-scented breeze of the pasture. It was heavy, cool, and deeply fragrant. It smelled of damp roots, of crushed clay, and of the deep, undisturbed layers of the earth that had been suddenly exposed to the air. It was a rich, ancient scent, reminiscent of a quiet forest floor after a week of heavy autumn rain. Embedded in the walls of the trench were the pale, delicate threads of severed roots, dangling softly like frayed yarn, reaching blindly out into the empty space. For one young man, moving slowly through the dim passage, that scent of damp earth was a sudden, overwhelming tether to his childhood. As his shoulder brushed against the dirt wall, dislodging a tiny shower of soft dust, he closed his eyes and let the scent carry him thousands of miles away. He was no longer in a foreign trench. He was a small boy again, following his mother into the cool, dark sanctuary of their root cellar beneath the farmhouse. He could almost see the dim yellow light of the oil lamp she held, casting warm shadows over the neat, dusty rows of glass jars filled with peaches and summer tomatoes. He could feel the cool, packed dirt floor beneath his bare feet. It was a memory of profound safety, of a place where the earth was used not to hide from danger, but to protect and preserve the sweet harvest of the summer. He wrapped that gentle memory around his shivering heart, letting the familiar scent of the clay soothe the racing flutter in his chest. But despite the comforting memories the soil could bring, the physical reality of the trench was a heavy, suffocating thing. It was an incredibly narrow passage, carved just wide enough for a single man to pass through. To walk down its winding path was to feel the constant, undeniable pressure of the earth pressing in from both sides. It was a profound claustrophobia, a feeling that the world had shrunk down to a space no wider than your own two shoulders. The men had to move with their backs slightly hunched, their heads ducked beneath the level of the grass above, moving in a slow, awkward crouch. Every time they took a step, the rough, heavy canvas of their uniforms scraped gently against the dirt walls, creating a soft, rhythmic shhh, shhh sound that echoed faintly in the enclosed space. The distant, mechanical thud of the heavy guns, which had felt so large and defining out in the open field, was suddenly muffled by the thick insulation of the soil. The grand, sweeping noises of the world were replaced by a hyper-intense awareness of the tiny, delicate sounds immediately around them. The creak of a leather harness. The soft clinking of a metal canteen chain carefully muffled by a resting hand. The steady, nervous inhale of the boy inching forward right beside you. In this tight, breathless corridor, where you could not see past the curve of the dirt wall just a few feet ahead, the mind naturally sought an anchor. For almost every man in that narrow line, the anchor became the boy crawling directly in front of him. A young soldier from a quiet, leafy suburb found himself staring intently at the back of his friend's boots. He watched the worn, scuffed leather of the heels as they lifted and fell in the soft mud. He watched the fraying edge of the canvas leggings, the small clump of wet clay clinging stubbornly to a shoelace. In the vast, terrifying scope of the morning, those boots were the only things that made sense. They were the only things he could control. As he followed those boots through the winding shadows, a fierce, beautiful, and entirely quiet instinct began to swell within his chest. It was an instinct older than words, older than the uniforms they wore. It was the instinct of absolute, unconditional protection. He looked at the narrow back of his friend, tracing the heavy canvas suspenders that crossed over his shoulders. He knew that this boy, this quiet friend who had helped him secure his parachute harness in the dim light of the airplane hours ago, was walking blindly into the unknown. If the winding trench held a sudden danger around the next sharp curve, it would find his friend first. The realization did not make him want to step back. It made him want to step closer. He closed the small gap between them, staying so close that he could feel the faint, residual warmth radiating from his friend's jacket. He made a silent, unshakable vow to the damp earth walls. "I am right here behind you." He whispered it only in his heart. "If you fall, I will catch you. If you cannot take another step, I will carry you. I will not let anything touch you from behind. I am your shield, just as you are my guide." It is a remarkably beautiful thing, the way fear can be so completely eclipsed by love. In the suffocating tightness of the trench, where panic should have easily taken root, a profound tenderness blossomed instead. They were not a line of soldiers. They were a single, delicate organism, connected by invisible threads of devotion, moving gently through the arteries of the earth. Suddenly, the boy in front slipped. The clay beneath his boot was slick with the morning dew that had dripped down from the grass above, and his footing gave way. He stumbled forward, his hand shooting out to brace himself against the dirt wall, his breath catching in a sharp, soft gasp. Before he could even fully lose his balance, the boy behind him moved. It was not a panicked rush, but a fluid, instinctive reaching out of the hands. He caught his friend by the thick fabric of his webbing, his grip firm and incredibly steady. He pulled back just enough to counter the weight, holding the boy upright in the narrow passage. They froze there for a long, heavy second. The boy in front rested his head against the muddy wall, his chest heaving with the sudden spike of adrenaline. The boy behind him kept his hands firmly planted on the canvas straps, his thumbs gently resting against his friend's shoulder blades. No words were spoken. In the quiet hush of the trench, words were entirely unnecessary. The boy in front simply reached back with a dirt-smudged, trembling hand and patted the fingers that were holding him upright. It was a feather-light touch, a tiny gesture of profound, exhausted gratitude. "Thank you." The grip on his shoulder loosened, giving a soft, reassuring squeeze before slowly letting go. "I've got you. Take your time." They took a collective, deep breath, their lungs expanding together in the narrow space, and slowly, deliberately, they began to move again. As they crept deeper into the labyrinth, this silent communion of care repeated itself all down the line. A hand reaching forward to gently push a dangling root out of a friend's face. A soft tap on the heel to signal a pause. A passing back of a small, quiet look of encouragement when the walls felt like they were pressing in just a little too tight. Every single boy in that trench was acting as a silent guardian for the boy ahead of him. And in a beautiful, mirroring grace, every boy knew that his own back was being watched with the exact same fierce, tender devotion by the friend behind him. It was a continuous, unbroken chain of humanity, woven tightly together in the dark. They did not know how long the trench was. They did not know what waited for them at the end of the narrow ribbon of sky. But as they crawled through the damp soil, surrounded by the intimate scent of clay and broken roots, the profound isolation they had felt falling through the night sky was entirely gone. They were buried in the earth, hidden from the golden sun, yet they had never been more illuminated by the quiet light of each other's presence. The claustrophobia of the dirt walls was held at bay by the expansive, boundless space of their shared trust. They moved forward not with the frantic energy of the afraid, but with the slow, deliberate grace of the deeply loved. In the quiet, shadowed heart of the first trench, surrounded by the sleeping roots of the Norman fields, they simply held onto one another, letting their quiet heroism lead them gently, softly, through the dark. Even the heaviest iron must eventually surrender to the quiet, enduring strength of the human heart. When the winding, claustrophobic path of the trench finally opened up, the young men spilled out into a wide, earthen bowl carved deeply into the Norman soil. In the center of this crater sat the source of the mechanical heartbeat that had haunted their morning. The gun was massive, a towering, unnatural structure of dark gray steel and heavy grease, sitting beneath a sprawling canopy of camouflage netting that filtered the golden morning sun into a dappled, pale green light. The transition from the creeping silence of the narrow passage to the capture of this immense machine happened in a breathless, chaotic blur. It was a sudden, rushing gust of wind, a flurry of movement and shouts that echoed off the dirt walls and vanished as quickly as it had begun. And then, just as suddenly, an overwhelming, ringing stillness fell over the crater. The gun was silent. The terrible, rhythmic thudding that had shaken the leaves of the apple orchards was gone, replaced by the soft, settling whisper of dry dust drifting back down to the earth. In this sudden, profound quiet, the adrenaline that had carried the boys through the morning began to recede, leaving behind a heavy, trembling exhaustion. They stood in the dappled green light, their chests heaving, staring at the massive iron beast they had just quieted. It felt surreal, like waking up from a deeply vivid dream to find yourself standing in a place you do not recognize. The air was thick with the bitter, sharp scent of burnt powder, but beneath it, the sweet, enduring smell of the turned earth remained, steady and grounding. As the dust continued to settle, the focus in the crater shifted. The great iron machine no longer mattered. The eyes of the men swept the earthen floor, searching instinctively for the soft, familiar canvas of their brothers. Near the back of the pit, resting heavily against the dark clay wall, a young man sat with his knees pulled up toward his chest. His head was tilted back, resting against the tangled roots that protruded from the soil, and his eyes were closed. His breathing was shallow and uneven. There was a tear in the rough wool of his jacket, just below the shoulder, and a dark, heavy stain was spreading slowly across the fabric. A boy from a quiet, snowy town in the northern woods saw him first. The sight of his friend sitting there, so incredibly still and fragile against the rough earth, caused a sudden, breathless drop in his chest. All the grand, sweeping notions of the morning vanished entirely. The world shrank down to a space no wider than the few yards of dirt between them. He did not run, running felt too loud, too disruptive to the fragile peace of the moment, but he moved with a swift, desperate grace, dropping his heavy wooden rifle softly into the dust as he fell to his knees beside his friend. "I'm here," the boy whispered, his voice trembling ever so slightly. "I'm right here with you." The wounded friend slowly opened his eyes. They were wide and pale, clouded with a sudden, deeply innocent confusion. He looked at the face hovering above him, taking a moment to recognize the familiar shape of his jaw, the smudge of dark soil across his nose. When recognition finally settled, a faint, exhausted smile touched the corners of his mouth. He did not speak. He only offered a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a quiet surrender to the care of his brother. The boy from the northern woods reached out with hands that, just moments ago, had been gripping cold steel with white-knuckled tension. Now, those same hands transformed. They became impossibly soft, moving with the delicate, practiced gentleness of a mother tending to a child resting in a feverish bed. He carefully unbuttoned the heavy canvas collar of his friend's jacket, folding the fabric back to reveal the wound. He did not look at the injury with horror, he looked at it with a profound, focused tenderness. He reached into the small canvas pouch on his belt, his fingers working the metal snap. He pulled out a small, tightly wrapped square of medical dressing. The sound of the waxed paper crinkling as he tore it open sounded incredibly loud in the quiet crater. As he unfolded the thick, stark white gauze, it looked completely out of place in this world of dark mud, green leaves, and gray iron. It was a beacon of pure, concentrated care. With agonizing slowness, he pressed the soft white cloth against his friend's shoulder. The wounded boy drew in a sharp, sudden breath, his eyes fluttering shut as a tremor ran through his body. I know, the tending boy murmured, his voice a continuous, soothing lullaby. "Just a little pressure. You're doing so well. Just breathe with me. Slow and deep." He kept his hand firmly pressed against the gauze, applying a steady, grounding weight. With his other hand, he reached up and gently wiped a streak of dark mud from his friend's pale forehead. His thumb brushed softly across the boy's brow, a gesture so intimately human, so deeply anchored in love, that it seemed to push the surrounding war entirely out of existence. Above them, the massive artillery gun cast a long, cold shadow. It was a monument to unfeeling engineering, a thing of pure, heavy iron meant only to destroy. But beneath it, nestled in the dirt, these two boys were creating a tiny, powerful sanctuary of healing. The contrast was breathtaking. The iron was vast and cold, but the boys were warm, and breathing, and absolutely overflowing with a fierce, protective grace. The machine could not feel, but the hands applying the bandage were trembling with the sheer weight of how much they cared. To keep his friend's mind away from the pain, the tending boy began to talk. He kept his voice low and rhythmic, letting the words flow like a gentle, meandering river. He didn't talk about the trenches, or the plains, or the ocean they had crossed. He talked about the things that were soft, and safe, and eternally beautiful. "Think about the front porch," he whispered, his eyes fixed on his friend's face. "Think about that old wooden swing you told me about. The one with the chipped white paint. Imagine sitting there right now. The sun is just starting to set, making the sky all pink and gold. You've got a tall glass of cold lemonade in your hand, and that old hound dog of yours is asleep right at your feet, dreaming about chasing rabbits." The wounded boy kept his eyes closed, but the tight lines around his mouth began to slowly smooth out. His breathing, which had been frantic and shallow, began to find a steady, matching rhythm with the quiet cadence of his friend's voice. He was listening. He was letting the words carry him away from the damp earth of Normandy, floating back across the world to a quiet summer evening where nothing hurt, and everything was perfectly in its place. You can hear the screen door slap shut, the tending boy continued, his own heart finding a strange, beautiful peace in the telling of the story. Your mother is coming out to call you in for supper. You can smell the bread baking. You're safe there. You're entirely safe. As he spoke, he carefully secured the bandage, wrapping a long strip of soft linen around the shoulder to hold the gauze in place. He tied the knot with meticulous care, making sure it was tight enough to hold, but gentle enough not to pull. He treated his friend's body as if it were made of fragile spun glass. When the dressing was finished, he reached for his metal canteen. He unscrewed the small black cap, the tiny chain clinking softly against the aluminum. He supported the back of his friend's neck with a warm hand, lifting his head just an inch from the dirt wall, and guided the rim of the canteen to his dry lips. The wounded boy drank slowly, the cool water soothing his throat. When he had enough, he turned his head away slightly, exhaling a long, weary sigh. He opened his eyes and looked up at the boy who had saved him. There is a specific kind of love that exists only in the quiet spaces between humans who have survived the dark together. It cannot be adequately described in letters sent home, and it cannot be easily explained to those who have not felt it. It was passing between them now, carried in the heavy, silent air of the crater. It was an unbreakable bond woven from shared fear, profound vulnerability, and the miraculous, healing touch of a gentle hand. The tending boy screwed the cap back onto his canteen and let it rest against his hip. He didn't want to leave his friend. He wanted to sit in the dirt beside him all day, guarding his sleep, keeping the shadows away until the sun went down. But the winding trench continued on, and the quiet leader was already gathering the remaining men near the far exit of the pit. There were other guns hidden in the fields. The heavy task of the morning was not yet done. I have to go just a little further down the line, the tending boy whispered, his hand resting softly on the unwounded shoulder. But I'm going to leave you right here. The medics are coming up behind us. They'll be here soon. You just rest against the earth. Let it hold you. The wounded boy nodded, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. He reached his right hand across his chest, his fingers weakly curling around his friend's wrist. Be careful, he breathed, the words barely a rasp. Keep your head down. I will, the boy from the northern woods promised, his throat tightening with an unexpected ache. I'll see you when the sun gets high. You just dream about that porch swing for a little while longer. He gently uncurled his friend's fingers, giving his hand one final, reassuring squeeze before slowly standing up. He picked up his heavy wooden rifle from the dust, the sudden weight of it feeling entirely unnatural after the delicate work of bandaging. He turned back toward the narrow opening of the next trench, leaving his friend resting quietly in the dappled green light beneath the camouflage netting. The massive iron gun sat silent behind them, a cold, defeated giant. It had been conquered not just by the sudden surge of men, but by the profound resilience of their humanity. In the heart of the crater, amidst the sharp smell of powder and the deep scent of the soil, the true victory belonged to the soft white bandage, the shared canteen, and the quiet, whispering voice that had carried a frightened boy safely home to a porch swing in the sun. As the men slipped back into the winding shadows of the earth, they carried that quiet victory with them, their hearts held steady by the fierce, gentle devotion they had witnessed in the dust. In the deep, winding veins of the earth, sight surrendered entirely to touch, and the only light left in the shadows was the warmth of the hand resting quietly on the shoulder ahead. Leaving the crater of the first silenced gun behind, the men pressed deeper into the labyrinth. The trench here grew narrower, the damp earthen walls pressing in with a heavy, ancient insistence. Above them, the morning sky was reduced to a fragile, jagged ribbon of pale blue, interrupted by the dark, tangled silhouettes of overhanging roots and sprawling camouflage nets. Down here, in the cool, fragrant dimness of the soil, the world shrank until it was no wider than a man's chest. To walk in this narrow way was to step into a space of profound vulnerability. The winding curves of the trench meant that a boy could never see more than a few yards ahead. The path was a constant, unfolding mystery, hidden behind corners of carved clay and shadowed earth. In the ordinary world, we rely on our eyes to tell us we are safe. We look down the street, we look across the field, we gather the horizon into our minds and find peace in what we can see. But in the trench, the horizon was gone. The eyes could offer no comfort. And so, humanity adapted, as it beautifully and always does. In the absence of sight, the young men turned to the profound, quiet language of touch. They formed a single, continuous line, a fragile chain of canvas and wool woven together through the dark. Because they could not speak, for the morning was still too fragile, and the unseen heavy gun still thumped in the distance, they learned to converse through the gentle pressure of their hands. A boy from the sprawling, golden wheat fields of the plains found himself walking behind a young man he hardly knew. Yet, within minutes of entering the narrow corridor, he knew the exact rhythm of this stranger's breathing. He knew the slight, weary slump of his left shoulder. He reached out his hand, clad in a worn leather glove, and placed it softly on the rough wool of the boy's back. That hand became a tether, an umbilical cord of trust connecting two beating hearts in the dark. When the boy in front slowed his pace, the boy behind felt the subtle shift in momentum through his fingertips and slowed his own steps in perfect, silent harmony. When the line came to a sudden, breathless halt, a hand would gently squeeze a shoulder, a soft, firm pressure that said, "Stop here. Wait with me." And when the invisible tension eased, a light, reassuring pat twice on the back meant, "It is clear. We can breathe again. We can move forward." It was a beautiful, entirely unspoken vocabulary. It was born of absolute necessity, yet it was executed with unimaginable tenderness. These were young men carrying heavy iron and the weight of a monumental morning, yet their hands moved with the delicate grace of a weaver at a loom. They did not push. They did not shove. They guided one another through the claustrophobic shadows with the fierce, quiet devotion of brothers. In this enclosed space, the shared rhythms of movement became a hypnotic, soothing lullaby. Left boot falling softly in the mud. Right boot finding the dry patch of clay. The soft scrape of a canvas sleeve against the dirt wall. The deep, synchronized exhale of the breath. They were no longer a group of individual boys lost in a foreign pasture. They had merged into a single, breathing organism, relying entirely on the gentle vibrations of the men around them. Somewhere near the middle of this quiet procession, a young man closed his eyes as he walked. He kept his hand firmly anchored on the shoulder of the friend ahead of him, letting himself be entirely led. He was a boy who had grown up in a crowded, bustling apartment building in a great city. He was used to the noise of the world, the chaotic rush of crowded sidewalks, and the feeling of being surrounded by thousands of strangers. But this closeness was different. In the city, the proximity of bodies was an accident of geography. Here, in the damp trench, the proximity was a deliberate act of survival and love. As he kept his eyes closed, trusting his friend to guide his footsteps, he felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of peace wash over his exhausted mind. He realized that to surrender your sight, to place your safety entirely in the hands of another human being, is perhaps the greatest act of faith a heart can make. He did not need to see the winding dirt path. He only needed to feel the steady, reassuring warmth of his friend's shoulder beneath his palm. It was enough. It was everything. As they crept forward, the physical intimacy of the narrow way brought forth small, profoundly beautiful moments of everyday heroism. The trench walls were rough, laced with the sharp, jagged ends of broken roots. The boy at the very front of the line, taking on the heavy burden of being the first to step into the unknown, suddenly felt a sharp sting as a trailing briar caught the side of his neck. He flinched, a quiet hiss of pain escaping his lips, but he dared not stop the line. The boy immediately behind him saw the small line of red appear on his friend's skin. Without missing a beat, without breaking the hypnotic rhythm of their slow march, the second boy simply reached his hand forward. He didn't just pull the thorny branch away, he held it back. He pinned the sharp briar flesh against the cold clay wall with his own palm, holding it there patiently until the third boy, and the fourth boy, and the entire line had safely passed it by. It was a tiny sacrifice. A scratched palm in exchange for the unhindered passage of his brothers. No one thanked him, for no words could be spoken, but as the last boy slipped past, he gave the holding hand a soft, fleeting brush with his own fingertips. A silent acknowledgement. A whisper of grace in the dark. The air in the trench grew warmer as the morning sun climbed higher above the camouflage nets, trapping the heat in the deep earth. The smell of the damp soil mingled with the scent of wet wool, saddle soap, and the faint, sweet aroma of peppermint from a crushed candy wrapper tucked deep inside a pocket. For one soldier, the heat and the close walls triggered a rising tide of panic. The claustrophobia, which he had fought back since they first slid into the dirt, began to claw at the edges of his mind. The walls seemed to be leaning inward, the ribbon of sky above feeling impossibly far away. His breathing grew shallow and frantic. His steps began to falter, disrupting the gentle, flowing rhythm of the line. The boy behind him felt the hesitation instantly. He felt the sudden, rigid tension in the shoulders beneath his hand. He knew the feeling well. He had fought the very same phantom in the dark hull of the transport plane hours before. He didn't push his panicking friend forward. Instead, he closed the small gap between them until his chest was resting softly against the canvas pack of the boy in front. He wrapped his hand entirely around the trembling shoulder, pressing his thumb deeply and firmly into the heavy fabric. It was a grounding touch, heavy and real. He leaned his head forward until his lips were just inches from his friend's ear. He didn't speak words, for words were too dangerous, but he began to hum. It was barely a sound at all, just a soft, vibrating resonance deep in his throat, carrying the melody of an old, slow hymn they had both sung in a wooden church during their training days. The panicking boy felt the vibration of the hum before he fully heard it. It was a low, steady frequency that seemed to pass directly from his friend's chest into his own. He closed his eyes, focusing entirely on that tiny, beautiful sound. He matched his ragged breathing to the slow cadence of the melody. Inhale on the rising note. Exhale on the falling note. Slowly, miraculously, the earthen wall stopped spinning. The claustrophobia retreated, chased away by the simple, profound comfort of a shared song. The panicked boy reached his own hand up, placing it over the hand that was gripping his shoulder, holding the fingers tightly against his collarbone. He took a deep, clear breath of the damp earth, nodded his head once, and stepped forward again, seamlessly rejoining the quiet, rhythmic dance of the line. They moved like this for what felt like hours, drifting through the winding arteries of the Norman pasture. They were entirely disconnected from the wide, beautiful world above them, yet they had never been more deeply connected to one another. Every time a hand rested on a back, it was not just touching a canvas uniform. It was resting just inches away from the letters folded carefully in a breast pocket. It was resting over the photographs of smiling mothers and laughing sweethearts. When a boy held the shoulder of the man in front of him, he was silently promising to protect all of those fragile paper memories. He became a guardian not just of a soldier, but of an entire life, an entire universe of love waiting patiently across the dark ocean. The narrow way was a place of shadows and dirt, a place designed for war and hiding. But the young men walking through it transformed it into something entirely different. They turned the claustrophobic corridor into a sanctuary of absolute trust. They filled the dark spaces with the unseen light of their devotion. They did not know what waited around the final bend of the earth. The heavy gun still needed to be found, and the morning was far from over. But as they pressed further down the line, moving in perfect, synchronized harmony, the fear of the unknown was softened by the profound comfort of the known. They knew the touch of their brothers. They knew the steady rhythm of their shared breathing. And they knew, with absolute certainty, that as long as they kept their hands gently resting on the shoulders ahead of them, they would never have to walk through the dark alone. In the shadow of the earth, the greatest miracles often hide in the quietest corners, waiting patiently to be found. As the young men pressed deeper into the winding labyrinth of the trench, the narrow path suddenly gave way to a small, hollowed-out room carved directly into the dark clay. It was a humble, earthen sanctuary, a quiet alcove built into the side of the deep ditch, fortified by thick, rough-hewn beams of oak. The camouflage netting above had parted just slightly here, allowing a single, solitary shaft of pale morning sunlight to pierce the gloom. The light fell gently across the damp floor, illuminating thousands of tiny dust motes that danced and drifted in the still, cool air. After the suffocating tightness of the narrow passage, stepping into this small room felt like stepping into a forgotten pocket of time. The heavy, rhythmic thud of the distant guns was deeply muffled by the thick dirt walls, reduced to a soft, almost imperceptible vibration. The air in this quiet space smelled faintly of old leather, spilled coffee, and the sweet, dark scent of the surrounding roots. A young soldier, his uniform heavy with the morning dew and his face smudged with the dark soil of the fields, stepped slowly into the alcove. He was exhausted. The fierce, protective adrenaline that had carried him through the winding shadows was beginning to softly ebb, leaving behind a profound, trembling weariness in his bones. He leaned his shoulder against the cool, supporting timber of the doorway and simply let himself breathe. He watched the dust motes swirling in the shaft of light, finding a strange, hypnotic peace in their slow, aimless floating. As his eyes adjusted to the dimness, he noticed a small, makeshift table sitting in the corner of the room. It was nothing more than a few wooden crates stacked upon one another, draped with a rough canvas cloth. And resting upon that canvas, catching the very edge of the morning sun, was a small, silver pocket watch. The young man took a slow, hesitant step forward. The trench was a place of heavy iron, rough wood, and damp soil. The delicate, polished gleam of the silver watch seemed entirely out of place. It was an object of civilization, a fragile piece of ordinary life left behind in the dark. He did not touch it at first. He simply stood over the crates, leaning in close. In the profound silence of the earthen room, he could hear it. Tick, tick, tick. It was a delicate, rhythmic whispering. The sound was incredibly soothing, a steady, mechanical heartbeat pulsing in the shadows. The boy closed his eyes and let the ticking wash over him. For a fleeting moment, he was no longer standing in a foreign trench. The familiar, comforting sound transported him to the quiet parlor of his grandfather's house on a sleepy Sunday afternoon, where the only sound was the grandfather clock measuring out the slow, peaceful hours of a gentle life. He opened his eyes and looked at the silver casing. He realized, with a soft, aching pang of empathy, that this watch belonged to another boy. A boy who had been sitting in this very chair just moments before they arrived. A boy who, despite wearing a different uniform, had likely wound that small dial with trembling fingers, counting the minutes until the sun came up, wishing with all his heart to be somewhere else. The ticking watch was a profound reminder of their shared, fragile humanity. Time passes precisely the same way for every heart, regardless of the soil upon which they stand. But as the young soldier looked down at the crates, his eyes drifted away from the silver watch. Resting just beneath it, half hidden in the shadows of the canvas cloth, was a folded piece of heavy, stiff paper. It was an entirely unassuming thing. It was not bound in a leather book, nor was it hidden within a locked metal box. It was simply lying there, vulnerable to the damp air and the falling dirt. Had the soldier not paused to listen to the gentle ticking of the watch, he might have turned around and walked back out into the winding trench. He might have overlooked it completely. But fate is a remarkably delicate thread. Slowly, the young man reached out his gloved hand. His fingers brushed against the cool silver of the watch, gently pushing it aside, and settled upon the folded paper. The texture of it was rough and dry beneath his thumb. He picked it up, the paper making a soft, crisp rustle that sounded incredibly loud in the quiet room. With agonizing care, as if he were handling a fragile butterfly whose wings might turn to dust, he began to unfold it. The paper was large, meant to be spread out across a wide desk. As he opened the final crease, he stepped forward, holding the document directly into the single shaft of sunlight filtering down from the roots above. It was a map. But it was not a map of towns, or roads, or winding rivers. It was a sprawling, intricate constellation of ink. Sweeping lines of deep blue and stark black covered the heavy page, dotted with careful, precise markings drawn in bright red pencil. The young boy holding the paper was not a general. He had not spent years studying the grand, sweeping strategies of the world. He was simply a boy from a small town, a boy who knew the best places to fish in the creek and the shortest way to walk to the cinema. Yet, as he stared at the sweeping lines of ink, a profound, chilling understanding washed over him. He recognized the gentle curve of the coastline drawn at the top of the page. He recognized the sprawling, cross-hatched shapes of the ancient hedgerows they had just crawled through. And there, scattered all along the hidden fields, following the curve of the water, were the red marks. There were dozens of them. Scores of them. Each one representing a nest of heavy iron, perfectly camouflaged, completely invisible to the young men wading through the cold ocean surf miles below. The map was the entire, hidden nervous system of the enemy's defense. It was the master key to the locked door of Normandy. The soldier's breath caught in his throat. The air in the small earthen room suddenly felt incredibly thin. He lowered the map slightly, his hands beginning to tremble with the sheer, monumental weight of what he was holding. The moment slowed down entirely, stretching out into a profound, meditative stillness. Think of the sheer, impossible serendipity of this discovery. Think of all the tiny, fragile choices that had to align perfectly for this exact piece of paper to end up in the trembling hands of this exact boy. If the wind over the channel had blown their transport plane just a fraction of a degree off course. If he had not found his friends in the dark labyrinth of the sunken lane. If they had walked past this tiny, hidden alcove without stopping to rest. If the boy who owned the pocket watch had remembered to slip the map into his coat before retreating. A single gust of wind sweeping through the trench could have lifted the paper and carried it away into the mud, where it would have been trampled beneath heavy boots and lost to the earth forever. But the wind did not blow. The paper was not trampled. It waited, patiently, beneath the ticking silver watch, for a tired boy to simply look down. The young soldier stood in the shaft of light, staring at the red marks, and his mind naturally drifted away from the trench. He thought of the thousands of unseen boys down on the beaches. Boys who were right now stepping off metal ramps into the freezing water, boys who were looking up at the terrifying, quiet cliffs, entirely unaware of the hidden iron waiting for them. He pictured their faces, faces just like his own, faces just like his friends, full of fear, full of hope, carrying letters from home in their damp pockets. And then, his thoughts traveled even further. They crossed the vast, dark ocean, drifting back to thousands of quiet, peaceful towns just waking up to the morning sun. He pictured a mother standing at her kitchen sink, looking out the window as she washed a coffee cup, praying softly for her son. He pictured a father walking down a dirt driveway to fetch the morning paper, his heart heavy with worry. He pictured a sweetheart sitting on a porch swing, tracing the faded ink of an old envelope. None of those people knew it yet, but their prayers had just been answered in a muddy ditch in France. The piece of paper in the boy's hands was no heavier than a handful of dry autumn leaves, but it held the weight of thousands of tomorrows. Because he had found this map, the invisible guns could be silenced. Because he had unfolded this paper, thousands of mothers would eventually hear the sound of their sons walking back up the front porch steps. Thousands of letters would be returned to their senders, carried safely in the pockets of breathing, living boys. It was a miracle made of what pulp and pencil lead. Tears, hot and sudden, pricked the corners of the young soldier's eyes. They were not tears of fear or of sorrow, but of a profound, overwhelming awe. To hold the lives of so many brothers in the palms of your hands is a beautiful, terrifying grace. He gently brushed a smudge of dirt from the corner of the map, his touch as tender as a kiss. He knew he could not keep it here. He knew this fragile tether of hope belonged to the quiet leader, the boy who had drawn their path in the dust of the farmyard. With deliberate, reverent hands, the soldier began to fold the heavy paper along its original creases. He did not rush. He folded it smoothly, perfectly, ensuring the corners met with exacting precision. When it was collapsed back into a small, unassuming square, he reached his hand up to the front of his jacket. He unbuttoned his breast pocket, slipping his fingers past the soft, worn paper of his own letter from home, and tucked the enemy map safely inside, resting it directly over his beating heart. He buttoned the flap closed, pressing his palm flat against the heavy canvas to ensure it was secure. He looked down at the wooden crates one last time. The silver pocket watch still sat on the canvas cloth, continuing its quiet, steady song. Tick, tick, tick. It was measuring the seconds of a morning that had just been irrevocably changed. He did not take the watch. It belonged to the earth now, a monument to the fleeting, shared passage of time. The young soldier turned away from the dancing dust motes and stepped out of the earthen alcove, returning to the winding shadows of the trench. He found his friends waiting just a few yards ahead, resting quietly against the clay walls. He moved down the line, his hand touching their shoulders with a new, profound reverence, until he reached the front. He found the quiet leader, who was peering cautiously around the next bend. The soldier reached out and tapped him gently on the arm. When the leader turned, the young boy did not speak a word. He simply reached into his breast pocket, withdrew the folded square of heavy paper, and placed it softly into the leader's open hand. Their eyes met in the dim light. The leader looked down at the paper, his thumb brushing over the stiff creases, and then looked back up at the boy. He saw the awe, the exhausted grace, and the quiet heroism shining in the soldier's tired eyes. In that silent exchange, the magnitude of the moment was entirely understood. No grand speeches were made. The leader simply nodded, a slow, deep bowing of his head, and tucked the miracle into his own pocket. They turned back toward the winding path of the trench. The heavy guns were still waiting, and the morning was still fraught with shadows. But as they stepped forward, the air felt undeniably lighter. They were no longer walking blindly through the labyrinth. They carried a map, found by chance, preserved by a quiet moment of reflection, and protected by the fierce, gentle devotion of a boy who simply paused to listen to the ticking of a watch in the dark. There is a profound, almost heavy weight to the sudden absence of sound, a ringing emptiness that rushes in to fill the space where thunder used to live. For hours, the deep, mechanical heartbeat of the heavy guns had defined the morning. It had been the rhythm to which the young men had marched, the invisible force that had guided them through the dark labyrinth of the hedgerows and the narrow, winding veins of the earth. But now, as the men stood in the final earthen crater, gathered around the last of the great iron machines, that rhythm was finally coming to an end. They worked with a slow, exhausted grace. There were no shouts, no hurried movements. Their hands, clad in canvas and stained with the dark, rich soil of Normandy, moved methodically over the cold steel. They slipped the heavy, vital pieces of the firing mechanism out of their greased housings, rendering the massive barrel completely, irrevocably still. When the final block of metal was carefully lifted away and set softly down into the damp dirt, the heavy task was done. The last machine was quieted. What followed was not a celebration. It was a sudden, sweeping wave of absolute silence. It washed over the pastoral fields like a physical tide, rolling through the winding trenches, slipping through the tangled roots of the hawthorn bushes, and spilling out over the sprawling apple orchards. The bitter, sharp echoes of the morning faded away, absorbed by the ancient, indifferent hills, leaving nothing behind but the vast, open quiet of the French countryside. To the young men standing in the crater, the silence was almost deafening. Their ears, so accustomed to the heavy, concussive pressure of the morning, strained to make sense of the sudden emptiness. For a long, suspended moment, no one moved. They stood perfectly still beneath the dappled green light of the camouflage netting, their chests rising and falling in slow, ragged unison, simply listening to the sound of the world stopping. And then, slowly, the true sounds of the morning began to timidly return. It started with the wind. A gentle, cooling breeze drifted down from the pale blue sky, rustling the leaves of the ancient oak trees in a soft, whispering chorus. It carried away the lingering, acrid scent of burnt powder, replacing it with the deeply comforting perfume of wet clover, damp clay, and wild meadow blossoms. Then, from somewhere high up in the leafy canopy, a single, solitary bird began to sing. It was a bright, clear, delicate melody, a tiny trill of life that seemed entirely out of place in a world carved of heavy iron and deep trenches. Yet, it was the most beautiful thing the young men had ever heard. The bird's song broke the spell. The chaotic, protective rush of adrenaline that had sustained them through the long, terrifying hours of the dawn finally began to recede, draining away into the earth and leaving behind a profound, trembling weariness in their bones. All around the crater, the men began to soften. Shoulders that had been locked tight with tension slowly dropped. Hands that had gripped heavy wooden rifles with white-knuckled desperation gently loosened their hold, letting the weapons rest softly against the dirt. One by one, the boys simply surrendered to the gravity of the earth. A young man from a quiet, winding street in a small Midwestern town leaned his back against the high clay wall of the trench. His legs, shaking with the sudden release of fear, finally gave way, and he slid slowly down into the dust. He let his head fall back against the cool, damp roots protruding from the soil, and he closed his eyes. He didn't think about the ocean he had crossed, or the sky he had fallen through. He only thought about the incredible, miraculous feeling of the warm morning sun resting upon his face. He lifted his hands, resting them softly in his lap, and looked at them through half-open eyes. They were completely covered in the dark grease of the artillery gun, mixed with the pale, dry dust of the trench and the dark brown mud of the fields. They looked like the hands of a stranger. He stared at his trembling fingers, and his mind drifted back to the life he had left behind. These were the same hands that had carefully turned the fragile pages of library books on quiet autumn afternoons. These were the hands that had held a freshly painted wooden birdhouse, perfectly still, while his father nailed it to the old elm tree in the front yard. These were the hands that had nervously, gently, reached out to hold the hand of the girl he loved as they walked home from the cinema under the streetlights. To look at his dirt-stained fingers now was to feel a sudden, overwhelming disconnect between the boy he was and the heavy things he had been asked to do. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, relatively clean handkerchief. With slow, deliberate motions, he began to wipe the grease from his skin. He was not just cleaning his hands, he was gently trying to wipe away the morning. He was trying to uncover the boy who built birdhouses and held hands, trying to make sure that soft, beautiful part of himself was still there, hidden beneath the dust of the fields. Beside him, another soldier had taken off his heavy metal helmet, setting it down in the clover with a soft, hollow clink. His hair was damp with sweat, matted against his forehead in the cool breeze. He reached for his metal canteen, unscrewing the cap with a quiet sigh. The water inside was lukewarm, tasting faintly of aluminum and the canvas pouch it rested in, but as he took a slow, lingering sip, it felt like a sacrament. He lowered the canteen and held it out toward the boy sitting next to him. No words were spoken. In the profound quiet of the fading echoes, language felt too clumsy, too rough to capture the delicate grace of the moment. The second boy took the canteen, offering a small, exhausted nod of gratitude, and drank. It was the simple, everyday communion of men who had walked to the edge of the shadows together and had somehow managed to walk back. Across the crater, the quiet leader stood leaning against the cold barrel of the dismantled gun. He did not sit down. He felt the heavy burden of responsibility still resting upon his shoulders, but it was no longer a frantic, terrifying weight. It was a slow, settling ache. He looked around the earthen room, his eyes lingering on each of his men. He saw the way they were breathing. He saw the way the tight lines of fear around their eyes had smoothed out into a mask of pure, watery exhaustion. He caught the eye of the boy from the crowded city, the one who had shared his chocolate in the misty dawn. The city boy was sitting with his knees pulled up to his chest, resting his chin on his crossed arms. When he saw the leader looking at him, he didn't offer a salute or a formal report. He just offered a soft, incredibly weary smile. It was a smile that held the entire story of the morning, the terror of the descent, the suffocating walls of the narrow way, the fierce devotion to the brothers beside them, and the surreal, beautiful realization that they were all still breathing. The leader returned the smile, a gentle upward curve of his own dirt-smudged lips, and gave a slow, deep nod. "We did it. You can rest now." The realization that the immediate task was done washed over the men in quiet, rippling waves. It is a strange and surreal thing to prepare your heart for the absolute worst, to fold away your hopes and your letters, and then to suddenly find yourself standing in the sunshine, completely safe. A young soldier near the edge of the trench reached his hand up to his chest, his fingers finding the familiar, comforting bulge of the breast pocket beneath his heavy canvas webbing. For the entirety of the morning, he had treated that pocket like a fragile reliquary. He had touched it in the dark of the transport plane. He had pressed his hand against it when the claustrophobia of the dirt walls had threatened to overwhelm him. Inside was a letter from his mother, a few pages of soft, blue-lined paper covered in her looping, familiar handwriting. Throughout the slow crawl toward the guns, he had made a quiet, private bargain with the universe. He had promised that if he just made it through the morning, if he could just see the sun get high in the sky one more time, he would finally open the letter and read it again. Now, in the fading echoes of the quiet pasture, he slowly unbuttoned the flap. He drew the folded paper out into the light. The edges were soft and worn from the countless times he had held it, a physical testament to how much it was loved. He unfolded it carefully, resting the paper on his muddy knees. He didn't just read the words, he heard her voice. He heard the gentle lilt of her laughter, the soothing cadence of her speech as she wrote about the blooming lilacs by the porch and the neighborhood dog that kept digging up her garden. A single tear, warm and sudden, slipped down his cheek, cutting a clean path through the dark soot on his face. It fell softly onto the corner of the letter, creating a tiny, dark bloom in the paper. It was a tear of pure, profound relief. He was reading the words of a world that was soft, and safe, and waiting for him. And for the first time since he had stepped out of the airplane into the night sky, he truly believed he was going to go back to it. As the men rested in the deep earth, their thoughts inevitably drifted outward, traveling across the blooming apple orchards and down toward the distant coast. They could not see the beaches from where they sat. They could not see the vast, cold ocean or the thousands of boys who were wading through the surf. But they knew, with a quiet, settling certainty, that the silence they had created here in the pasture was currently spreading down to the water. The heavy, mechanical heartbeat that had been throwing unseen fire toward the coast was gone. The sky above the beaches was just a little bit clearer. The path forward for those thousands of strangers was just a little bit safer. The men in the trench had not won the entire war. They had not solved the grand, sweeping conflicts of the world. But they had done the remarkably heavy thing they had been asked to do. They had given the boys on the beach a quiet sky. There is an immeasurable, quiet heroism in saving a life you will never see, and protecting a boy whose name you will never know. The men sitting in the damp clay did not speak of it, but the knowledge of it wrapped around them like a warm, invisible blanket. It made the exhaustion in their bones feel a little less heavy. It made the bitter taste of the morning feel a little less sharp. The sun continued to climb higher into the pale blue sky, bathing the Norman fields in a rich, golden light. The shadows of the ancient hedgerows grew shorter, pulling back toward the thick roots. The gentle breeze continued to whisper through the hawthorn bushes, entirely indifferent to the history that had just been written beneath them. The battle of the morning was over. The great, terrifying wave of purpose had crashed against the shore and retreated, leaving behind the quiet, ordinary debris of human survival. The young men remained in the trench, enveloped in the fading echoes of what had been. They were entirely still, a collection of breathing, beautiful souls resting in the cradle of the earth. They listened to the singing bird. They felt the cool breeze against their damp faces. They held onto their canteens, their clean handkerchiefs, and the fragile, worn letters from home. They had crossed the dark threshold, and they had quieted the thunder. And now, in the sudden, eerie silence of the pastoral fields, they simply allowed themselves the profound, delicate grace of resting in the light. To walk away from the heavy iron and back into the shadow of the trees was to feel the earth finally offer a gentle, holding embrace. The morning's heavy task was finished, left behind in the deep, scarred craters of the pasture. As the young men turned their backs on the silenced guns, they moved with a slow, drifting cadence, leaving the bright, blinding glare of the open fields to seek the quiet sanctuary of the ancient woods. The edge of the trees rose up before them like the grand, welcoming archway of a quiet, green cathedral. Stepping beneath the sprawling canopy of the oaks and elms was like stepping into a different world entirely. The harsh, golden light of the mid-morning sun was immediately fractured by millions of trembling leaves, filtering down to the forest floor in soft, dappled pools of pale green and gold. The air here was dramatically cooler, completely untouched by the bitter, sharp scent of burnt powder that still clung to the trenches. Instead, the woods breathed out a rich, soothing perfume of damp moss, decaying autumn leaves, and the sweet, dark sap of ancient wood. The moment they crossed the threshold into the shade, the invisible strings that had held them taut for so many hours simply snapped. The fierce, protective adrenaline that had fueled their steady march, that had given them the impossible strength to carry heavy weapons and pull each other through the mud, suddenly evaporated. It vanished into the cool air, leaving behind a profound, overwhelming emptiness in their bones. Exhaustion did not just settle upon them, it poured into them, heavy as lead. It was a bone-deep weariness that made their heavy canvas uniforms feel like they were woven from thick iron chains. Their boots, caked in the thick, pale clay of the dugouts, dragged through the soft carpet of ferns with a soft, rhythmic hush, hush, hush. There were no commands given to halt. There was no formal perimeter established in those first, fragile moments. The body simply knew that it was time to stop. One by one, the boys began to surrender to the gravity of the earth. A young man from a quiet, winding valley found the thick, gnarled roots of a massive oak tree. The tree must have stood there for hundreds of years, its trunk as wide as a small room, its bark deeply grooved and textured by countless seasons of rain and sun. The boy did not just sit down, he let his knees fold beneath him, sliding slowly down the rough, ancient wood until he was resting securely in the deep pocket between two massive roots. He leaned his head back against the bark, the rough texture catching the heavy wool of his collar. He closed his eyes and let out a long, ragged breath that seemed to carry the entire morning out of his lungs. To his tired spine, that ancient tree felt like the strongest, safest thing in the entire world. It had stood through storms and winters, indifferent to the fragile, fleeting conflicts of men. It offered no judgment, no orders, no fear. It offered only shade, and the quiet, enduring strength of the earth. He let himself be entirely held by it, absorbing its ancient stillness directly into his trembling frame. All around him, in the dappled green light, the other young men were finding their own quiet places to fall. A boy sitting a few yards away reached up with incredibly heavy hands to unclasp the canvas strap beneath his chin. He pulled the heavy steel helmet from his head, placing it gently on a patch of soft, bright green moss beside him. Without the helmet, he suddenly looked impossibly young. His hair was damp and matted to his forehead, his face pale beneath a mask of soot, grease, and the dark soil of the fields. He ran his dirty fingers through his hair, letting the cool forest breeze touch his scalp. It was a tiny, glorious sensation, a quiet reminder that he was still a living, breathing part of the natural world. Beside him, a profound and delicate drama of survival was unfolding in miniature. A young soldier, his shoulders slumped and his eyes staring blankly at the ferns, reached into the deep pocket of his canvas trousers. His fingers emerged holding a small, crumpled paper box of cigarettes. He tapped one loose, placing the white cylinder between his dry lips. Then, he reached back into the pocket for a small box of wooden matches. But his hands would not obey him. The fine motor skills, the delicate control required to strike the match, had been entirely washed away by the receding tide of adrenaline. His fingers trembled violently, a rapid, uncontrollable shaking that made the tiny wooden stick dance and slip against the striking paper. He tried once, the match snapping in half. He pulled out another, his frustration mounting, a quiet, desperate tear pricking the corner of his eye. He wasn't crying because of the match, he was crying because the trembling was the physical proof of the terror his body had just survived. Before he could try a third time, a shadow moved over him. The friend sitting to his right, a quiet boy who had walked behind him through the darkest parts of the trench, shifted his weight. He did not say a word. He simply reached out his own two hands, which were entirely steady now, and gently took the matchbox from his friend's trembling fingers. The friend struck the match. It flared with a tiny, brilliant hiss, a bright spark of sulfur that quickly settled into a warm, orange teardrop of flame. The friend cupped his hands around the fire, protecting it from the gentle forest breeze, and leaned forward. The trembling boy leaned in, the tip of the cigarette meeting the flame. He drew in a slow, deep breath. The tip glowed a bright, fierce red in the shadows. As he exhaled, the trembling in his hands began to miraculously slow. The smoke curled upward in a thick, blue-gray ribbon, catching the shafts of sunlight and twisting beautifully toward the canopy above. The friend who had held the match gave a soft, reassuring pat to the boy's knee before sitting back against his own tree. It was an act of pure, quiet intimacy. In a world that had demanded they be hard and unyielding, they had found a way to be incredibly soft with one another. That tiny, shared flame was a beacon of profound kindness, a silent declaration that they would carry each other's burdens, no matter how small. The simple, bodily needs of survival began to slowly take precedence over everything else. After the smoke, came the water. Canteens were unhooked from canvas belts, the metal chains clinking softly, a sound that no longer needed to be muffled, for the danger had passed. A soldier unscrewed the black cap of his aluminum flask and lifted it to his lips. The water inside was lukewarm, tasting strongly of the metal and the damp canvas pouch it lived in. But as it flowed over his parched tongue and down his dry, aching throat, it tasted like an absolute miracle. He drank slowly, closing his eyes to fully experience the sensation of the water quenching the deep, dusty thirst of the morning. When he lowered it, he didn't put the cap back on. He wiped his mouth with the back of a dirty sleeve and held the canteen out to the space beside him. The boy resting against the neighboring elm tree reached out and took it. Their fingers brushed against the cool metal. They didn't speak. They only shared a long, exhausted look. Their eyes were bloodshot, surrounded by dark circles of fatigue, but they were remarkably clear. They were looking at each other not just as soldiers, but as survivors. The passing of the canteen was a quiet communion. Drink this. Be replenished. We are still here. As the quiet minutes stretched into hours, a deep, narcotic peace settled over the clearing. The forest seemed to actively wrap itself around them, weaving a protective blanket of shade and silence. The birds, which had been frightened away by the thunder in the fields, slowly returned to the branches above. They resumed their sweet, delicate singing, a natural lullaby that contrasted so fiercely with the heavy reality of the day. Beneath the oldest oak, the boy who had slid down into the roots was no longer entirely awake, but neither was he fully asleep. He existed in a soft, drifting twilight of the mind. His hands rested loosely in his lap, his head tilted slightly to the side. He felt the familiar, heavy shape of the canvas pocket over his heart. He did not need to unbutton it to know the letter was there. He just rested the palm of his hand over the rough wool, letting the warmth of his own chest seep into the paper beneath. In this quiet, drifting state, his mind let go of the woods, let go of the distant trenches, and traveled thousands of miles across the deep blue ocean. He floated effortlessly back to a quiet, sunlit kitchen. He could see the dust motes dancing in the light of the window, much like they danced here in the forest. He could hear the soft, rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall, and the gentle hum of the refrigerator. He pictured the worn, wooden grain of the kitchen table, where that very letter had been written. He gathered these ordinary, beautiful images and built a fortress out of them in his mind. He tucked himself inside that imaginary kitchen, wrapping the memory of safety around his exhausted heart. He knew that the war was still waiting for them somewhere beyond the trees. He knew that eventually, the quiet leader would stand up, adjust his gear, and nod toward the next hidden road. But that was tomorrow's problem. Or perhaps the afternoon's. For right now, in this suspended, beautiful pocket of time, there was only the soft moss beneath him, the ancient bark against his spine, and the steady, rhythmic breathing of the brothers resting all around him. They were a scattered flock of tired boys, lying beneath the canopy of the world, bathed in dappled light. They had faced the unimaginable dark, and they had walked back out into the sun. They did not need to be heroes in this moment. They only needed to be human. They only needed to breathe, to drink the lukewarm water, to watch the blue smoke rise into the leaves, and to let the gentle, enduring earth rock them softly into a deep and dreamless sleep. When the noise of the world finally falls away, the loudest sounds left behind are the words we have not yet spoken. The ancient woods of Normandy had granted the young men a profound and necessary sanctuary. As they lay beneath the sprawling canopy of oak and elm, the golden light of the afternoon filtering through the leaves in soft, dappled pools, their bodies finally surrendered to the heavy pull of exhaustion. The trembling in their hands had slowed. Their breathing had deepened into the slow, rhythmic cadence of sleep and quiet contemplation. But as the physical body rests, the mind, freed from the immediate demands of survival, begins to wander. It slips the tethers of the present moment and drifts, like a solitary leaf on a slow-moving river, toward the places and the people it loves most. In the quiet hush of the forest, the vast, dark ocean that separated these boys from their homes seemed to magically shrink. A young soldier, resting his head against the soft, mossy curve of a root, closed his eyes and let his spirit travel. He did not see the French ferns or the rough bark of the trees. He saw the familiar, sun-faded paint of his own front door. He imagined the quiet routines of his household, unfolding exactly as they always did. He pictured his mother standing by the kitchen sink, wiping her hands on a checkered apron, her eyes drifting toward the window as she listened for the familiar squeak of the postman's bicycle. He pictured his father sitting in his worn armchair, the evening newspaper resting unread on his lap, his thoughts entirely consumed by the son he had sent into the unknown. Lying there in the damp earth, the young man began to compose a letter in his head. If he had a piece of crisp paper and a fountain pen right now, what would he say? How could he possibly translate the immense, terrifying, and beautiful weight of this single morning into ink? The truth was, he wouldn't. He would not write about the deafening thud of the hidden guns, or the claustrophobia of the winding trench, or the sharp, bitter scent of the powder. To write those things would be to place the heavy burden of his fear onto the delicate shoulders of the people he loved. Instead, the letter he wrote in the quiet space of his mind was a masterpiece of tender protection. "Dear Mother and Dad," he whispered silently to the canopy above. "I am safe. I am resting under some trees that look just like the old oaks down by the creek. The weather here is beautiful today, the sky is clear, and the countryside is green and peaceful. Please don't worry about me. I am with good friends." This was a different kind of heroism. It was not the bravery of stepping out of the shadows into a field of iron. It was the profound, quiet courage of shielding the ones you love from the darkness you have seen. Every boy in that grove was writing a similar letter in his heart. They were weaving gentle fictions, choosing words that would bring comfort, sending imaginary smiles across the water to keep the home fires burning bright and untroubled. They gathered up all the love they held inside, wrapping it tightly around the terrifying truths of the morning, ensuring that only the light would make the journey home. But as their eyes slowly opened, blinking against the dappled sunlight, the reality of the forest gently reasserted itself. The young men looked around the clearing, their gaze drifting from one resting friend to the next. They saw the boy from the city, fast asleep with his helmet resting on his chest. They saw the quiet farm boy, staring softly up at the swaying leaves. And then, inevitably, their eyes found the empty spaces. The grove was peaceful, but it was not whole. In the chaotic scatter of the midnight descent, and in the winding labyrinth of the morning's shadows, not every boy had found his way to the rally point. Not every brass cricket had been answered in the dark. A boy leaning against a fallen log felt a sudden, profound ache settle deep within his chest, a heaviness that had nothing to do with the heavy canvas webbing he wore. He was looking at a patch of soft, green ferns just a few feet away, and his mind populated it with the ghost of a friend. He remembered the boy who had sat beside him on the transport plane, a boy with a bright, easy laugh, who had nervously tapped his boots against the metal floorboards and shared a story about a girl he was going to marry in the spring. That bright laugh was missing from the grove. There is a strange, suspended quality to grief when it finds you in the middle of a quiet forest. There are no formal ceremonies here, no mournful music, no gathering of a community to share the weight of the sorrow. There is only the sudden, echoing realization of an absence. The boy by the log did not weep loudly. The sorrow was too deep, too vast for simple tears. Instead, he reached out and gently rested his hand on the patch of ferns where his friend should have been sitting. It was a delicate, honoring touch. He let his fingers brush the soft green fronds, closing his eyes to hold the memory of the bright laugh perfectly still in his mind. He realized, with a quiet, breaking heart, that the letter his friend had meant to write to the girl waiting for the spring would now forever remain unwritten. All the beautiful promises, the descriptions of the French countryside, the declarations of an enduring love, they were gone, vanished into the mist of the Norman morning. How does a heart carry such a profound silence? It carries it by becoming the vessel for the unspoken words. The young men resting under the canopy silently took on the sacred duty of remembering. They looked at the empty spaces between the trees, and they made quiet, unbreakable vows to the brothers who were not there. "I will carry your memory for you," a soldier whispered into the collar of his jacket, his eyes fixed on the distant line of the hedgerows. "When I go home, I will look at the sky for you. I will listen to the rain on the roof for you. I will live the quiet, ordinary days that you were not given, and I will never, ever let the world forget the boy who sat beside me in the dark." This shared burden of memory wove the surviving men even tighter together. They were no longer just a group of friends, they were the living keepers of a profound and beautiful history. The quiet resilience that had carried them through the trenches now transformed into the gentle strength required to mourn without breaking. A canteen was passed again, moving silently from hand to hand. When it reached a boy whose eyes were shimmering with unspoken tears, the hand that offered the water lingered just a moment longer. A thumb brushed softly against a trembling knuckle. It was a microscopic gesture, but it held the weight of the entire world. It said, "I know who you are looking for. I am looking for him, too. We will hold this sadness together." The afternoon sun continued its slow, graceful arc across the sky, deepening the colors of the forest from pale gold to a rich, warm amber. The shadows of the great oaks stretched longer across the damp earth, drawing the blanket of the approaching evening gently over the exhausted men. They lay there in the quiet aftermath, a symphony of breathing chests and resting hearts. Their pockets were full of letters they had read 100 times, and their minds were full of the beautiful, protective letters they would write as soon as they found a pencil. But the heaviest things they carried were the letters not written, the silent, invisible words of the boys who had stayed behind in the shadows of the dawn. They did not let the grief crush them. They folded it delicately, carefully, and tucked it into the safest, deepest corners of their souls, right beside the memories of front porch swings and Sunday dinners. They let the ancient, indifferent forest hold them, finding a strange, enduring peace in the soft rustle of the leaves and the steady presence of the brothers still sitting beside them. As the day slowly began to soften into dusk, the grove remained perfectly still. The noise of the world was gone, and the unspoken words had found their resting place. The men simply breathed, honoring the fallen with their quiet survival, wrapped in the profound, melancholy beauty of a love that transcends the boundaries of the ocean, the earth, and time itself. To look out over the edge of the world and know you have made it safer is a remarkably quiet and beautiful thing. As the long, heavy hours of the afternoon began to stretch and soften, the deep shadows of the ancient forest slowly began to shift. The harsh, bright glare of the midday sun, which had baked the clay of the trenches and warmed the damp wool of the soldiers' uniforms, was finally beginning to yield. The sun was tracing its slow, inevitable arc toward the western horizon, and as it dipped lower into the sky, the light it cast over the Norman countryside underwent a breathtaking transformation. It turned from a stark, blinding white into a rich, liquid gold. This was the golden hour, that fleeting, magical pocket of time just before the dusk, where the world seems to pause and breathe a deep sigh of relief. The light did not just fall upon the fields, it seemed to embrace them, painting the tops of the towering hedgerows in warm amber and turning the dust of the sunken lanes into drifting clouds of glittering pollen. The young men, having rested in the cool sanctuary of the oak grove, began to quietly stir. The profound exhaustion still lingered in their bones, a heavy, settling weight that made every movement slow and deliberate, but the frantic, terrifying edge of the morning was entirely gone. They gathered their heavy canvas packs, their wooden rifles, and their canteens, moving with the hushed, reverent grace of a congregation slowly leaving a quiet church. Guided by their quiet leader, they walked softly to the very edge of the tree line, where the high ground gently fell away, opening up into a vast, sweeping vista of the French coastline. They stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the outermost branches, hidden in the dappled shade, and looked out over the world. Below them, stretching out for miles, was a patchwork quilt of green pastures, quiet stone farmhouses, and sleepy, winding roads. But their eyes did not linger on the beautiful countryside. Their gaze was drawn inevitably outward, past the fields, past the final line of trees, to the hazy, distant expanse of the ocean. From this high vantage point, the sea looked incredibly peaceful. It was a vast, shimmering ribbon of deep blue and silver, catching the reflection of the golden sky. But as the young men squinted against the fading light, they could see the faint, dark shapes scattered across the water and the pale curve of the sand. They were too far away to hear the roar of the engines or the crashing of the surf. They were too far away to see the individual faces of the men wading through the cold water. From the edge of the forest, the great, sweeping movement on the beaches below looked entirely silent. It looked like a distant, miniature world, moving in slow motion beneath the setting sun. A profound, breathless stillness settled over the line of boys standing in the trees. All morning, they had been entirely consumed by the few feet of earth immediately in front of them. They had fought the terrifying claustrophobia of the narrow trenches, they had measured their lives by the distance to the next hawthorn bush, and they had focused all their love and protection on the single brother walking just ahead of them in the dark. Their world had been impossibly small. But now, looking down at the sweeping curve of the distant shore, the true, monumental scale of what they had done finally clicked into place. A young man from a quiet, dusty town in the American Southwest leaned heavily against the rough bark of an elm tree, his dirt-smudged hands resting on the wooden stock of his rifle. He looked at the distant, sandy shore, and then he looked back over his shoulder, toward the hidden pastures where the heavy iron guns now sat dismantled and silent. He closed his eyes and drew an imaginary line in his mind. A long, invisible thread stretching from the cold, greased barrels of those hidden machines, flying high over the apple orchards, arcing gracefully through the pale blue sky, and landing directly on that curving stretch of sand. His breath caught softly in his throat. Those massive guns had been pointing exactly there. The rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat that had shaken the morning dew from the leaves had been designed to rain invisible fire down upon the very water where those tiny, distant shapes were currently walking. He opened his eyes and looked at his own hands. They were scraped and bruised, the fingernails packed with dark Norman soil. They were the hands of an ordinary boy, hands that had nervously fumbled with a matchbox just an hour before. Yet, these ordinary, trembling hands had reached into the dark earth and stopped the thunder. A wave of realization washed over him, so pure and overwhelming that it brought a sudden, warm pressure to the back of his eyes. Because he had crawled through the mud, because his friends had bravely crossed the terrifying threshold of the open pasture, the sky above that distant beach was quiet. He looked down at the thousands of unseen strangers stepping onto the sand. He did not know their names. He did not know what towns they came from, or what songs they liked to sing, or what dreams they carried in their damp pockets. But in that golden moment, he loved them with an absolute, fiercely protective devotion. They were his brothers, separated by miles of open air, bound together by a quiet miracle they would never fully understand. The boys on the beach would never know about the narrow, winding trench. They would never know about the small, silver pocket watch ticking in the dark, or the map drawn in the dust of the farmyard. They would never know the name of the quiet leader who had pointed the way through the leaves, or the gentle hands that had wrapped a white bandage around a wounded shoulder beneath a camouflage net. And that was the most beautiful part of it all. It was a gift given in absolute, anonymous grace. Beside him, another soldier slowly reached up and removed his heavy steel helmet, holding it against his chest. He let the cool evening breeze ruffle his damp hair, his eyes fixed on the golden horizon. He was thinking of the letters. In his own breast pocket, pressed safely against his heart, he carried the familiar, comforting words of his family. He knew how precious those folded pieces of paper were. He knew that across the dark ocean, his mother was waiting for his return with a quiet, desperate hope. As he looked down at the thousands of men on the beach, he realized that every single one of those tiny shapes represented an entire universe of love. Every boy down there had a mother who worried, a father who waited, a sweetheart who checked the mailbox every single afternoon. If the heavy iron guns in the pasture had not been silenced, how many of those letters would have suddenly stopped arriving? How many front porches across the world would have been permanently shadowed by an echoing, unbroken silence? The boy pressed his hand firmly against his own pocket, a solitary tear slipping quietly down his cheek, cutting a clean path through the dust. He was not crying out of sorrow. He was crying out of a profound, gentle satisfaction. Because of their terrifying, exhausting mourning in the hedgerows, thousands of mothers would eventually hear the screen door slap shut. Thousands of fathers would feel the firm, warm embrace of their sons again. Thousands of ordinary, beautiful lives would simply be allowed to continue, unwinding in the quiet peace of their hometowns, entirely unaware of the boys in the trees who had gifted them their tomorrows. The quiet leader stepped slowly to the edge of the shade, the golden light catching the worn canvas of his uniform. He did not offer a grand, sweeping speech. He did not boast of victory or speak of the heavy currents of history. He simply stood beside his men, looking out at the water, and let the profound weight of their accomplishments settle softly around them like a warm blanket. He reached out and placed a firm, steadying hand on the shoulder of the boy standing next to him. It was the same, familiar touch they had used in the darkest parts of the trench, a touch that communicated everything when words were simply not enough. "Look at what you did," the touch seemed to say. "Look at the lives you saved. Look at the quiet sky." All along the tree line, similar moments of quiet communion rippled through the group. A canteen was passed, the metal clinking softly in the stillness. A small, tired smile was exchanged between two boys who had shared a piece of dry chocolate at the break of dawn. They leaned their heads together, resting in the shared warmth of their survival and the breathtaking magnitude of their unseen heroism. The sun finally touched the very edge of the water, melting into the distant sea. The sky ignited into a spectacular display of bruised purple, soft rose, and deep, fiery orange. The golden hour had reached its absolute peak, wrapping the Norman coastline in a deeply soothing, almost holy light. The air grew slightly cooler, hinting at the approaching night, but the men in the trees did not shiver. They were warmed from the inside out by a deep, unwavering peace. The heavy, terrifying burden they had carried since they first stepped into the transport planes had finally been lifted. The phantom fear that had haunted their steps had been entirely washed away by the gentle, rolling tide of their own quiet courage. They stood together on the high ground, a small, dirt-smudged fellowship of perfectly ordinary boys who had been asked to do an extraordinary thing, and who had done it with unimaginable grace. They had stepped into the dark so that others might walk in the light. As the sun sank deeper, taking the last of the golden rays with it, the distant beaches began to blur, softening into the twilight shadows. The men took one final, long look at the quiet coast, breathing in the scent of the salt air and the sweet forest pine. Then, moving together with the slow, synchronized rhythm they had learned in the narrow way, they turned away from the edge of the world. They stepped back into the protective embrace of the ancient woods, their hearts full, their minds at peace, carrying the gentle, profound satisfaction of a beautiful day's work perfectly done. When the sun finally surrendered the sky, the darkness that rushed back in was no longer a stranger, but a quiet, heavy friend. The transition from the golden dusk to the deep velvet of the Norman night was a slow, graceful fading. The vibrant colors of the fields melted into soft, muted grays, and the towering shapes of the ancient hedgerows became solid walls of black against the dimming horizon. The air, which had been warmed by the afternoon sun, quickly grew sharp and cool, carrying the familiar, damp scent of the earth and the sweet, lingering perfume of the sleeping apple orchards. For the young men scattered beneath the sprawling canopy of the woods, the arrival of the night was a profound relief. It was a blanket pulled over the world, signaling that the impossibly long day was finally, truly over. They began to prepare their resting places with a slow, exhausted reverence. There were no soft mattresses here, no warm quilts smelling of lavender and sunshine. There was only the hard, uneven ground of a foreign forest, laced with ancient roots and covered in a fragile layer of fallen leaves. Yet, to bodies that had been pushed to the absolute limits of human endurance, this patch of dirt felt like a sanctuary. They moved with quiet, deliberate care, trying not to disturb the profound stillness of the grove. A boy knelt in the damp grass, using his bare hands to sweep away a pile of sharp twigs and loose stones, smoothing out a shallow depression in the soil. He unfastened his heavy canvas webbing, letting it drop to the earth with a muffled thud, and carefully folded his rough wool jacket to serve as a makeshift pillow. As he lay down, the cold of the ground immediately seeped through his damp trousers, a shivering reminder of the physical world, but he simply curled his knees toward his chest and closed his eyes. The earth was hard, but it was not shaking. It was not exploding. It was simply holding him. As the final light drained from the sky, the canopy above them began to reveal a breathtaking masterpiece. One by one, the stars appeared, piercing the dark like tiny, brilliant pinpricks of silver light. They were so bright, so incredibly clear in the unpolluted night air, that they seemed to hang just inches above the topmost branches of the oak trees. Lying on their backs, the young men looked up through the gaps in the leaves, and a beautiful, collective realization washed over the grove. These were the exact same stars that were currently shining over the quiet, sleeping towns they had left behind. A boy from the sprawling, flat plains of the Midwest traced the familiar shape of the Big Dipper with his eyes, remembering how his grandfather had pointed it out to him on a warm summer night sitting on the hood of a dusty pickup truck. A boy from a coastal city found the North Star, anchoring himself to the very same light that guided the fishing boats safely back into his home harbor. The vast, terrifying ocean that separated them from their families suddenly felt a little less wide. The sky became a bridge, a shared, glittering ceiling that covered both the damp forests of Normandy and the safe, warm beds of the people they loved. They stared into the endless dark, and they whispered quiet prayers into the cosmos, trusting that the light of those distant stars would carry their love all the way home. But the night was cold, and the silence of the woods, after a day filled with the deafening roar of history, was almost too heavy to bear alone. The mind, left to wander in the dark, inevitably circles back to the sharp edges of the morning. The shadows in the trees began to look a little too deep, the rustle of a badger in the underbrush sounded a little too loud. And so, to keep the shadows at bay, the whispers began. They started as soft, formless murmurs drifting through the cold air, no louder than the wind moving through the dry leaves. Two boys, lying shoulder to shoulder in a shallow trench they had scooped from the roots, turned their heads toward one another. They couldn't see each other's faces in the pitch black, but they could feel the warmth of each other's breath. "Are you awake?" one whispered, his voice trembling just a fraction. "Yeah," the other breathed back. "I can't seem to close my eyes. Every time I do, I'm back in the airplane." There was a long, heavy pause, filled only by the rhythmic chirping of a cricket hiding in the bark of the tree above them. "I was terrified today," the first boy confessed, the words slipping out into the dark before he could catch them. It was a profound, beautiful vulnerability. In the daylight, wearing the heavy canvas uniform, he felt the need to be strong, to be an unbreakable pillar for the men around him. But here, stripped of the light and the noise, he was just a boy who had been asked to walk through the fire. The boy lying next to him didn't offer a hollow platitude. He didn't tell him to be brave, or that there was nothing to fear. He simply reached his hand out in the dark, blindly searching the damp leaves until his fingers brushed against the rough wool of his friend's sleeve. He wrapped his hand around his friend's wrist, an anchor in the terrifying ocean of the night. "Me too," he whispered back, his voice thick with an exhausted grace. "When we were crawling through that narrow ditch, I don't think I took a single breath. I just kept looking at your boots. I just kept telling myself that if I followed your boots, I'd make it out. To admit fear is to drain it of its power." In the quiet intimacy of the Norman night, these whispered confessions became a profound form of healing. They were weaving a safety net out of their shared vulnerability, realizing that courage is not the absence of terror, but the quiet, incredibly difficult decision to take a step forward anyway, usually because you are holding the hand of a friend. All across the grove, these tiny, whispered conversations bloomed in the dark. They didn't talk about the grand strategies of the war, or the heavy iron guns they had silenced. They talked about the things that truly mattered. They talked about the taste of their mother's cherry pie. They talked about the smell of rain on a hot asphalt street. They debated, with hushed, serious reverence, whether the local baseball team had any chance of winning the pennant this year. They filled the cold, foreign woods with the warm, ordinary details of their deeply loved lives. It was a gentle rebellion against the harshness of the day, a quiet insistence that their humanity, their softness, and their memories had not been stolen by the trenches. As the hours crept toward midnight, the temperature dropped further, a biting chill settling over the damp earth. A young soldier, his uniform still damp with the morning dew, began to shiver. It was a deep, uncontrollable trembling that rattled his teeth and made the dry leaves beneath him rustle loudly. He curled himself into a tight ball, wrapping his arms around his chest, trying desperately to conserve whatever small warmth he had left. The boy sleeping next to him, woken by the sound of the rustling leaves, opened his heavy eyes. He saw the tight, shivering silhouette of his friend in the starlight. Without a second thought, without a single whispered word, the boy sat up. He reached into his own canvas pack, his fingers clumsy with the cold, and pulled out his single, spare wool blanket. He didn't just toss it over his friend. He unfolded it with agonizing care, shaking out the wrinkles, and gently draped it over the shivering shoulders. He tucked the rough edges carefully beneath his friend's arms, making sure no cold air could slip through the gaps. The shivering boy let out a long, shuddering sigh as the heavy, scratching warmth of the wool settled over him. He reached up, his fingers finding the hand that was tucking in the blanket, and gave it a weak, exhausted squeeze. It was an everyday heroism so incredibly small that it would never be recorded in a history book. But in the grand, sweeping arc of a human life, is there anything more profoundly beautiful than sacrificing your own warmth so that a brother might finally find sleep? The shivering slowly stopped, replaced by the deep, rhythmic breathing of true rest. The boy who had given up his blanket lay back down on the cold earth, pulling his collar up around his ears. He was colder now, but his heart was incredibly full. He looked up at the stars, feeling a strange, profound peace settle over his soul. He realized, in that quiet moment, that he was irrevocably changed. None of them were the same boys who had climbed into the vibrating hulls of the transport planes just 24 hours ago. The fires of the morning had burned away the illusions of their youth, leaving behind a quiet, tempered maturity. They had seen the terrible fragility of the human body, but they had also witnessed the unbreakable, astonishing strength of the human spirit. They had learned that the world can be incredibly dark, but they had also learned that they could be the light for one another. The boy reached his hand up to his chest, resting his palm against the breast pocket of his jacket. The paper inside was crisp and cool against his skin. He didn't need to read the letter tonight. He just needed to know it was there, a physical reminder of the love that was waiting for him at the end of this long, winding road. He thought of the friends who were not lying in the grove tonight, the boys who had stayed behind in the shadows of the morning. The grief was still there, sitting quietly in his chest, but it was no longer a sharp, jagged pain. It had softened into a deep, enduring ache, a melancholic reverence. He whispered their names to the stars, a soft litany of love sent up into the night, promising them that they would never be forgotten, that they would be carried forward in the hearts of every man sleeping under the canopy. Slowly, gently, the whispers in the grove began to fade. The shared stories, the quiet confessions, and the soft rustle of shared blankets gave way to the profound, heavy silence of exhaustion. The adrenaline was completely gone. The fear had been folded away. There was only the slow, synchronized rising and falling of their chests, 100 hearts beating in quiet rhythm with the sleeping earth. The Norman countryside wrapped them in its ancient embrace. The wind sighed through the oak branches, singing a soft, rustling lullaby. The stars held their steady, watchful vigil above. Tomorrow would bring a new sun, new roads, and new shadows to face. But for this one, suspended night, they were safe. They were together. And as the last conscious thought drifted away into the dark, they surrendered themselves to the deep, beautiful grace of sleep, resting softly beneath the quiet, infinite watch of the stars. The earth has a beautiful, boundless capacity for forgiveness, quietly pulling the heaviest shadows down into the soil and weaving them into wildflowers. If you were to walk through the damp, green fields of Normandy today, leaving the narrow country roads behind and stepping softly into the quiet pastures, you would not find a world of iron and fear. The heavy, deafening heartbeat that once shipped the morning dew from the leaves has been entirely silenced, replaced by the gentle, rhythmic hum of the living earth. Countless seasons have slowly turned since that misty dawn. Autumn winds have stripped the ancient oaks of their leaves time and time again, laying down thick, protective blankets over the forest floor. Winter snows have fallen in absolute silence, freezing the clay, only to melt away into the sweet, fragrant rains of the spring. And with each passing season, with every gentle drop of water and every warm ray of the summer sun, the earth has been slowly, meticulously healing. The violent, jagged scars that were carved so deeply into the pasture are gone. The sharp edges of the trenches, where the young men once crawled shoulder to shoulder in the suffocating dark, have surrendered to the patient, smoothing hands of time and weather. The heavy walls of dark mud have slowly collapsed inward, settling back into the earth from which they were violently torn. Now, if you look closely at the rolling green meadow, you will only see a series of shallow, sweeping depressions in the grass. They look like the natural, gentle dips of a quiet valley, soft hollows where the morning mist likes to gather and sleep before the sun rises. In these gentle hollows, nature has planted a stunning, triumphant garden of peace. Where the bitter scent of burnt powder once stung the air, the wind now carries the incredibly sweet fragrance of white clover and wild mint. Bright red poppies nod their delicate heads in the breeze, their paper-thin petals glowing fiercely in the golden afternoon light. Delicate blue cornflowers and tiny, yellow buttercups crowd the edges of the ancient hedgerows. The earth has taken the terrifying memory of the heavy iron and buried it beneath a vibrant, living tapestry of color. It is a profound and poetic closure, a quiet testament to the undeniable truth that life, eventually, reclaims everything. The pastoral beauty of Brécourt Manor is entirely restored. It is a working farm once again, just as it was meant to be. If you stand perfectly still near the edge of the tree line, you can hear the incredibly soothing sounds of ordinary life. You can hear the low, comforting rumble of cows grazing lazily in the deep grass, their heavy hooves stepping safely over the ground that was once fraught with shadows. You can hear the cheerful, chaotic chirping of sparrows darting in and out of the hawthorn bushes, building their tiny, fragile nests deep within the tangled briars that once hid trembling boys. You can hear the distant, rhythmic creak of a wooden tractor cart rolling down the sunken lane, a sound of harvest and growth, of planting and providing. Yet, beneath this beautiful, pastoral innocence, the pasture holds a profound and invisible memory. The earth forgives, and the earth covers, but the heart of the world never truly forgets. The quiet heroism of that morning is permanently anchored in the soil. The ancient oak trees, standing like silent, wise sentinels along the edge of the grove, still remember the boys who leaned against their rough bark. The deep roots still hold the phantom warmth of the young men who slid down into their embrace, seeking a moment of peace and a chance to simply breathe. If you rest your hand against the trunk of one of those massive trees, you can almost feel the lingering echo of their presence. You can almost hear the soft, exhausted sigh of a boy finally taking off his heavy steel helmet, the tiny, metallic spark of a match being struck in the shadows, and the hushed, deeply comforting whispers of friends keeping each other warm in the dark. The true legacy of what happened in these quiet fields is not found in the dirt, but in the vast, beautiful web of human connection that blossomed because of it. Think of the young man who knelt in the dust of the farmyard, drawing a simple, fragile map with a wooden stick. Think of the boy from the crowded city who reached out with steady hands to light a cigarette for his trembling friend. Think of the gentle fingers that wrapped a stark white bandage over a wound in the dappled green light. Because they chose to step out of the shadows, because they relied entirely on their love for one another, the trajectory of the world was irrevocably changed in a million tiny, beautiful ways. Because the heavy guns were silenced in the pasture, thousands of young men wading through the cold ocean surf miles away were allowed to simply stand up and walk onto the sand. They were allowed to survive. And because they survived, they eventually took the long, slow boats back across the dark ocean. They returned to the quiet towns, the bustling cities, and the wide, sprawling farms they had dreamed of in the trenches. Because of the boys in the hedgerows, countless letters made it safely home. Imagine the moment those letters were pulled from the mailboxes. Imagine the tears of pure, overwhelming relief falling onto the kitchen tables, the profound joy of a mother realizing she would hear the screen door slap shut once again. Those letters, with their faded blue ink in their soft, worn creases, did not disappear. They were carefully folded and tucked into cedar boxes. They were tied with delicate ribbons and hidden in the top drawers of wooden dressers. They became sacred family relics, tangible proof of a love that survived the darkest of nights. Because those boys came home, quiet, ordinary lives were allowed to unfold. Marriages were celebrated in small wooden churches filled with spring flowers. Houses were built with front porches and creaking wooden swings. Children were born, and then grandchildren, filling the world with bright, echoing laughter and new, beautiful stories. None of those generations, running through sprinklers on hot summer afternoons or learning to ride bicycles on quiet suburban streets, were present in the damp trenches of Normandy. Yet, their very existence, the very breath in their lungs, is a direct, radiant echo of the quiet courage shown by a small group of friends in a muddy ditch. This is the gentle embrace of time. It takes the sharp, terrifying moments of the past and softens them into a legacy of enduring love. Sometimes, in the soft light of the modern morning, visitors come to the quiet pasture. A man with silver hair might walk slowly down the sunken lane, his boots crunching softly on the fallen leaves. He might carry a worn, black and white photograph in his coat pocket, a picture of a remarkably young, dirt-smudged boy with a tired smile, standing in front of a canvas tent. The man looks out over the shallow, green dips in the earth, and he runs his hand over the top of the tall grass. He does not see a battlefield. He sees the exact place where his father, or his grandfather, discovered the profound depths of his own humanity. A young woman might stand near the edge of the tree line, closing her eyes as the cool wind brushes her face. She might whisper a quiet, solitary thank you into the breeze. The wind catches her whisper, carrying it up through the trembling leaves of the ancient elms, lifting it higher and higher into the pale blue sky. It is a gentle lullaby, a psalm of gratitude sung by the present, offered entirely to the past. As the day comes to a close in the present day, the sun begins its slow, familiar descent over the Norman coast, just as it did on that very first evening. The golden hour arrives, painting the pasture in rich, warm strokes of amber and rose. The deep shadows of the hedgerows stretch out long and protective over the sweet clover. The birds sing their final, delicate melodies of the afternoon, tucking themselves safely into the thick, thorny branches of the hawthorn bushes. The air grows cool, carrying the scent of the nearby sea and the damp, comforting smell of the soil. The world here is so incredibly peaceful. It is a peace that was paid for with trembling hands and quiet tears, but it is a peace that has taken root, strong and unyielding. When the twilight finally deepens into night, the stars emerge one by one, piercing the dark velvet sky. They are the exact same stars that watched over the exhausted, shivering boy so many years ago. They shine with the same cool, brilliant light, eternal and unchanging. But the whispers that float up to them now are not born of fear or sorrow. They are the whispers of the wind moving through the tall grass, the soft rustle of the leaves, and the quiet, steady breathing of an earth that is entirely at rest. The young men who walk these fields are no longer lost in the dark. Their memory is not held in cold iron or harsh words, but in the blooming of the wildflowers, the gentle dips of the green meadow, and the quiet, beautiful lives of the families they saved. They have become part of the enduring, peaceful tapestry of the world. And so, as the night falls completely over the quiet pastures of Brécourt Manor, let your own heart find a deep and settling peace. Let the gentle embrace of time wash away the heavy burdens of your own day. Know that the earth heals, that love endures, and that the quiet, everyday heroism you carry within you is enough to light the dark. Close your eyes, listen to the soft rustle of the imaginary leaves, and let the beautifully quiet history of this ordinary, miraculous field rock you gently, softly, into a deep and dreamless sleep.